Thank you, and thank you, Zolina, and good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Brussels briefings. And when Zolina contacts DEFCO to try to identify the topics, we clearly said we need to do something on land, water, and energy, especially on water and the land and water dimension, because we always say that water is the new oil in certain parts of the world, and clearly what's happening around certain conflicts on food crisis is actually emanating from the problems around water use. It's also a great honor that Gordon is with us today. With Professor Conway, we have had a number of exchanges in a number of high-level events, so his presence today also marks an important role of the Montpellier panels and their analysis on this area of work, and also the World Resources Institute. We all agree that land, water, energy issues are key also in trying to resolve food crisis. We speak about food systems now. If you go, like I did in the last months, to the EAT conference and the EAT Lancet Commission outcome, this topic is very high on the agenda. I just give you some highlight figures on water, and these will probably be explained later on. But 2.1 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water services. Water scarcity affects around 4 of every 10 people. This is WHO. 90% of all natural disasters are water related. This is from UNSDR. Agriculture accounts for 70% of global water withdrawal, FAO source. Roughly 75% of all industrial water withdrawals are used for energy production. And almost 400,000 children under 5 die every year from diarrheal diseases. This is WHO UNICEF source. And around 4.5 billion people lack safely managed sanitation services, also from UNICEF. To meet growing demand for water and food, we clearly need to think and act differently. And since 2011, the European Commission has reprioritized its work on sustainable growth and refocused on a number of core sectors, including agriculture. The nexus, water, energy, and food, clearly appears as a way to avoid perverse outcomes and maximize opportunities, and water had to be reinforced in our activities in other sectors. The Nexus approach represents a shift from a pure sectorial approach to solutions to cross-sectorial, coherent, and integrated perspectives, integrating the clients of water, agriculture, and energy sectors. It may sound obvious that all governments, international organizations, and donors should take this approach. However, it remains difficult. An integrated approach requires creative thinking, flexible institutions, building new relationships, and a more long-term vision. Moreover, in the context of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, the Nexus perspective looks even more appropriate. Food, water, and energy are targeted under SDG 2, 6, and 7. And SDG 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns, represents much of what the Nexus strives to achieve. The global community is well aware of food, energy, and water challenges, but has so far addressed them too much in isolation within sectorial boundaries, and at country level, fragmented sectorial responsibilities, quite often lack of coordination across ministries, and inconsistencies between laws and regulatory frameworks leads to misaligned incentives. Clearly, this requires an enhanced dialogue, collaboration, and coordination to ensure that co-benefits and trade-offs are considered and that appropriate safeguards are put into place. At the beginning of 2016, the Commission launched, together with Germany, the Nexus Dialogue Programme. This will be presented by my colleague Veronica later on. Outside the Nexus Dialogue, but in strong coordination with it, Nexus activities will also be integrated in the proposed regional program supporting the Nile institutions, with the tune of 10 million from the EU and 3.5 million from GIZ that will implement the action, and in an EU-funded project for the Senegal River. The Nexus approach is equally important for land use. Land use contributes to several objectives: agriculture and food, environment protection, biodiversity, climate change resilience. And with this in mind, we are also preparing landscape initiatives to simultaneously address these aspects at country level. In addition, we also have a portfolio, and as you know, the DESIRA initiative on agriculture research for development, which is a portfolio of 270 million euros for the period 18-20, which supports a set of actions that promotes, amongst others, integrated responses addressing water, energy, and food challenges. Such a multiple objective approach can only work when people living on land, and notably local populations and indigenous peoples, have secure land rights that enable them to manage and invest in a sustainable way. The EU is supporting sustainable land rights through numerous projects with more than 245 million euros in 40 countries. Water and energy are essential for any agriculture and food production, water for irrigation as well as animal and human consumption, energy for agricultural operations including irrigation pumps, food processing, as well as heating and cooling. The efficient, integrated, sustainable use of energy, water and land is the great challenge we need to tackle for our well-being. And I think also what happened in Cape Town a few years ago, this topic is also going to be quite high in the next few weeks at the high-level political forum on sustainable development. I see a number of key events that organizations like EuropeAid and UN Water are organizing on water and climate change, for example, and how water is crucial to achieve the SDGs. I think today's events and the HLPF events starting on the 11th of July with CTA, I think we should continue building, tracking what's happening on this dossier, because it will be an important component in the next thinking of the Commission, and clearly this will be an important part of the portfolio for the new MFF, looking at it from a more integrated approach. So today's proceedings and today's conclusions will clearly feed into the thinking for the new Commission, and we look forward for the end of the day with the conclusions and with CTA compiling these results. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to receive the feedback later on in the day. Isolina, thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonard, and indeed, thank you very much for having proposed this topic, which is very, very interesting. And it was quite challenging, actually, to prepare it as well. And we had, it's not in your folders, but it's online, and we can revisit that. We had done together a Brussels briefing in 2011 on the water we eat, which was extremely interesting. You find all the resources. Actually, one of our partners was the International Water Management Institute, so I'm happy that Kofi working in West Africa is joining us. And we had very, very good discussions, and we have very good resources online on the water footprint, as well as the virtual water trade. And I think Professor Donorico also is working in this area. So thank you very much. So without delay, I give the floor to Michael Ailu, who is the director of CTA, my organization, since 2010. And his previous assignments before joining CTA were on the CGIR, ECRAF, the latest one, but also in Indonesia in C4, and of course a number of academic and practice experience. As you know, CTA is based, the headquarters are in Holland, in Wageningen, in the Netherlands, since 1983. We have a small office in Brussels, but most of our colleagues are, of course, at headquarters. So thank you very much for coming from there for the briefing.
Thank you very much, Isolina. Good morning, everyone. Let me join the others in welcoming you to this briefing and to thank you for joining us, and especially our speakers, who have traveled long distance to join us. Well, I think as most of actually what I was going to say has been very well covered by Leonard. So, in terms of the background, what are the challenges and some of the statistics. So I really have just very short remarks to make. Of course, this is a very critical topic, I think, as Leonard was saying, in terms of achieving the SDGs, but also in terms of meeting the commitments of the Paris Climate Agreement. Indeed, just as we all know, delivering water, energy, and food for all in a sustainable and equitable way is one of the greatest challenges that we have, that we are facing now. And again, Leonard has given us very good statistics. The only one I would, of course, always like to add is that still the number of hungry people is on the rise. The latest number is 821 million people, largely due to conflicts and climate change, and there is a lot of interaction, between these factors affected by climate change and conflicts. And also on the energy side, still about 1 billion people lack access to electricity and so on. The other point I think I like to make, of course, in terms of the water intake, also have to remember that agriculture takes a lot of water, as was said previously, the 70% withdrawal. But also in terms of what kind of crops we produce and intensity of especially livestock production and the meat-based diets will be putting a lot more stress on water systems. So typically it takes 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water to produce 1 kg of rice and 15,000 liters to produce 1 kg of beef, and 4,300 to produce a kilo of chicken meat. So in terms of the future sustainability, the type of food that we produce is very critical. Of course, impact of, again, food loss is also another factor I think we should try to remember. 30% of the food produced is lost or wasted, in different ways. Of course, the challenges in developing countries are different from what we see in developed countries. But again, that's also a major drain on natural resources. I think one last point I like to make is, of course, when we look at improving efficiency of the food system along the agri-food value chain, to improve energy, for example, using innovative technologies like, satellite data and so on. So CT has been doing quite a bit of work in this area, using satellite data. For example, we had a number of projects, one of them in the Gazira scheme in Sudan, where we have introduced satellite data to provide information on crop growth, humidity, nutrient needs of plants, and so on. And based on that information, farmers were given extension advice through mobile phones, and they were able to reduce significantly their water use, whereas they were able to improve productivity by up to 60%. So based on that experience, we developed another project in Uganda, which was actually funded by the Netherlands Space Office, and I'm happy Rudy is here with us this morning. I'm sure he will probably talk about some of those projects. But one of those projects we have is in Uganda, where we scaled up this approach, providing satellite information, weather advice, and index insurance, and so on, covering almost 250,000 farmers, and again, getting some significant improvements in terms of natural resource use as well as productivity. So I think the key message here is that we really have to see and explore how digital innovations and technology can really help us to improve resource use efficiency and productivity. So I think there is a lot of potential in that area, and I'm happy to report that we just produced a new research report on digitalization in African agriculture, which I will have a copy here. If Leonard, if you don't mind, it's here, and we also have it online. So here we also show how different kinds of solutions can really help improve productivity, income, market access, finance access, and so on, and climate resilience for smallholder producers. So I think one message I like to emphasize is we have to try and mainstream, some of these innovations and see how we can improve, agri-food system performance, whether it's smallholder or large scale. So with that, I look forward to the discussion this morning, and again, I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So without any delay, first let me, before I forget, because we always run. Actually, today we have to finish on time because there will be another meeting following us. Thank you very much to the interpreters, because most of the time I don't even do that because we are running. So in advance, thank you very much for your passions and your work. You will find in you most of they are also online. I mean, the presentations today, including the translation. It could be that you don't have a translation of one or two that we just received yesterday, but all is in line. You have the reader as well. We will appreciate any feedback on that. I now give the floor and the task, thanking him very much to V. Moltov. As I said before, he's the deputy head, working with Leonard Mizzi. He has been at DEFCO a very long time. Actually, we started the briefings together. We started number one. We designed them together. So I'm very, very pleased. Then he abandoned us. He went to some of the delegations in country and then to Rome still for the European Commission, of course. So I'm very, very pleased that now he's back in Brussels and is still, interested and coming and supporting us to the briefings. So Wim, thank you very much in advance.
Thank you, Isolina, and good morning to all. Again, I marvel at the number and the quality of speakers that you have been able to gather around the table. And I'm sure that everyone, just like me, wants to hear their voices. So I'll maximize the time for the speakers. Nevertheless, as you said, there are some time limits. So we have about 15 minutes for each of the speakers. And given the extreme experience you have, you will certainly be able to do that within that period of time. I'm also not going to introduce everyone extensively. There are CVs in the reader, and anyway, if I had to do that, the summary alone would take us to 11 o'clock. But without much ado, very happy to introduce the very first speaker, Professor Paolo Dodorico from Berkeley University, clearly with Italian roots, isn't it? Yes, so not only from across the ocean. So please, the word is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. And today I'm going to talk about the role of water in this the nexus of land, food, energy, and most of the water we use as human societies is used for agriculture, and particularly for the production of food. So my focus here on water is water for food production, non-drinking water, because as we see, is just a small, tiny fraction of of the human appropriation of water resources, and it entails different types of issues. The water used in agriculture is we use two types of water. In rain-fed agriculture, we only use rainfall, which has been named as green water, and then to increase production, about 20% of the agricultural land is irrigated and uses water from rivers, streams, groundwater. This is often known as blue water. And if we look at the total amount of water used for agriculture, it's about 16% of the total evapotranspiration from terrestrial ecosystems. So it's quite a bit of water used for crops, but also for the production of livestock, because it goes into the production of grass or also of feed. And then a small part of these crops are used now for bioenergy, and they claim a certain amount of water. If we look at the use of blue water, so at irrigation, we have that irrigation in many parts of the world is claiming either groundwater stocks or environmental flows. We have done this type of analysis, looking with the global models, looking at for different parts of the world, whether the water application for irrigation exceeds the availability, where the availability is defined as the surface or groundwater runoff minus the environmental flows. We see that these conditions are exceeded in part of the world. About 40% of the irrigation, according to this criteria, should be defined as unsustainable. If we look at Africa more specifically, there isn't a lot of irrigation to begin with, and there isn't much of sustainable irrigation, but still about the statistics now for the whole continent is that about 40% of the water used for irrigation is used unsustainably, so depleting groundwater stocks or environmental flows. There is an increasing demand for water for food production, for agriculture in general. This is driven by population growth, is driven by the dietary changes we heard about a few minutes ago, and the new uses of water for bioenergy. And the reason why we have the interest in the increasing consumption of meat, which is a consequence of increasing affluence in some parts of the world, is that it takes much more water to produce 1 calorie of animal food than 1 calorie of plant food. And based on some projections, in between now and the mid of the century, 20% we will see a 20% increase in water consumption just for these dietary changes. So what about energy? We use water for energy production, I said mainly in the form of biofuels. This is both green and blue water, because part of this agriculture is rain-fed agriculture. But we use water also for the extraction of fossil fuels and some forms also of non-renewable, renewable energies, like to clean solar panels, etc. Overall, the water used for energy, the blue water used for energy production, is a tiny fraction of the human appropriation of water resources. In fact, we see that irrigation is the big player, and the water used for energy is mostly for biofuels, partly also for the extraction of fossil fuels. What is interesting is that the reliance on fossil fuels is much less than the reliance on fossil fuels, but they consume quite a bit of water. From the point of view of big players in biofuel of biofuel consumption and use, there isn't much contribution from African countries. The big players are mostly the US, Brazil, and European countries. What we see is that in a pattern or an emerging pattern is the plantation of oil palm in West Africa, which could be then lead to, again, use of land and water for bioenergy in Africa. This is not a problem of water, also a problem of land. We have done this analysis. If we look at the current agricultural land and we ask this land to meet our energy and food needs, depending on how much of our present energy needs we try to meet, we can meet the needs of a population of different size. And so this is just a thought experiment, but just to show the fact that this is a short blanket. There isn't enough land to meet the needs, both food and energy needs of humanity using biofuels. And this leads us back to another type of thought, the fact that when we look at also at fossil fuels, we tend to look using inappropriately the term production instead of extraction. For extraction of fossil fuels, we don't need much water, but for the production of those fossil fuels, millennia ago, a lot of water was used for the production of those plants, and that then contributed to the production of that energy. And then, so our current energy, we have done this exercise with simple replacement rules, and to meet our current energy needs, the water cycle would not have enough, would not be sufficient to meet our current energy needs. We are using water from the past. And for the near future, we expect a sustained reliance on fossil fuels. And in recent years, there has been an interest also in the use of unconventional fossil fuels. With this, I'm referring to oil sands and shale deposits. If we look at these shale deposits, many of them are in countries where there isn't enough water to extract them, or where the extraction of this shale oil and shale gas will conflict with agriculture. And this, in the case of Africa, this is pretty obvious in the case of Northern Africa. So in the recent years, there has been an interest in the literature in approaching the question of how we can feed the world. And there are two possible ways. We can go by intensification of agriculture on existing agricultural land, or expansion of agriculture at the expenses of other ecosystems. The ecologists don't like and also don't like the second approach, because it would lead to habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity, and increased carbon emissions. However, also the intensification has its own problems, and I think there are two main problems. One is that in many cases, intensification requires water, requires irrigation, and there are again other problems of sustainability. The second problem is that in many parts, the places where we can intensify agriculture are places where the eel gaps are big. And this applies also to many African countries. If the gaps are big, often is because there have not been investments or capability to make these investments. So advocating for the closure of the Eel Gap and the investments in technology often is indirectly a way to advocate for a transition from subsistence farming to larger scale commercial agriculture, which also has problems on rural and implications for rural livelihoods. Let's look at the closure of the Eel Gap. If we look at some analysis we have done, if we close the Eel Gap, we can feed about 4 billion people worldwide. However, these analyses don't take into account the fact that water is needed to close the Eel Gap. If we account for this factor, we see that it's possible to sustainably, I apologize, I realize the captions are a little bit small. So in the green part of the world, we see areas where we could expand irrigation in rain-fed areas without depleting environmental flows or groundwater stocks. The yellow regions are regions where the closure of the Eel Gap would entail an unsustainable use of water resources. So if we account for these constraints, we can feed 2.8 billion people, not 4 billion people, as I said before. If we also remove unsustainable irrigation from currently irrigated areas, this goes down to 1.8 billion people. So this, in the case of Africa, we can zoom in. We can see that since the Eel Gaps are big, if we do that sustainably, it's possible to bring irrigation and increase the consumption of water and also the production of food by 100%. In some regions, there could be a negative change. In other areas, it would be a positive change with the possibility of increasing food production. So and then if we look globally at the ability, and we look also at projections of population growth, we see that we can see whether at the closure of the Eel Gap, some regions of the world can reach self-sufficiency or not. And we see that many regions of the world would still remain in conditions of trade dependency. And so they would not be able to produce enough food to feed themselves. This explains why there has been trade has been a big component in any analysis of global food security, because many regions don't produce the food they need. And trade, about 25%, 24% of the food we eat is available through international trade. This is associated, this goes back to the notion of virtual water by Alan, with the idea that the trade is associated with a virtual transfer. It's not physical, but it's virtually present in these commodities of water. We reconstructed the patterns of virtual water trade. We see that in the last 30 years, there has been a huge increase in the globalization of water resources through trade, with an increase in participation of exports from South America, Brazil and Argentina, to Southeast Asia. So trade dependency corresponds also to a dependency on water resources that countries don't control directly. This shows how African countries some African countries, this shows the number of trade partnerships. African countries are less integrated in these global patterns of trade. There are other phenomena of globalization of water that are not associated with trade, but with the international land investments. There has been a number of studies on this phenomenon on large-scale land acquisitions and the fact that they've increased a lot in the last 15 years. And this phenomenon is associated with an acquisition of water resources. In fact, we claim that water is one of the main drivers or motivators, factors motivating these investments. Many of the investors' countries have plenty of land, but they don't have water. There's been a rich debate on this issue of large-scale land acquisition. There are two different points. The point whether this is a way to close the Eel Gap, so is this a way to intensify agriculture, and this has the implications I mentioned before, that is a commercialization of agriculture which could have impacts on rural livelihoods because it would displace rural communities and farmers. Or is this a phenomenon of agricultural expansion? Do investors target virgin land that is arguably not used for agriculture, but is still used by communities for hunting or for other activities, fuel, wood harvesting, etc.? And there's been concerns about environmental impacts, not in the case of Africa. We have done mostly studies in Southeast Asia. These areas are preferential targets for deforestation and losses of habitat. In the case of African countries, we have estimated that these land acquisitions, in this land, is possible to plant enough crops to feed between 120 and 200 million people at gap closure. There are big Eel gaps, but then based on data available through the land metrics, we see that only 3% of the land in Africa is being put under production. Maybe these are data based on 2017, but so basically many times investors acquire the land but they don't use it, so there is not even a net benefit for either local or foreign populations. And many of these investments in Africa are by foreign corporations. So one of the hidden goals of these investments is the acquisition of water resources, and investors tend to target regions that or land that have preferential access to water resources. And so this is an important phenomenon that I think needs to be considered in the analysis of food and water security. So an alternative to intensification or expansion of agriculture would be a strategy of sustainable intensification, a strategy that tends to close the Eel Gap on existing agricultural land without expanding cultivations, but without at the same time requiring major changes in technology and investments in technologies in places where this financial or institutional capacity are lacking. And so in that case, it's possible still to use some approaches that can increase food production, either by using using natural resources more effectively, or using methods or using water more effectively. With this, I'm referring to two possible directions. One is all forms of irrigation that avoid evaporation by sustained transpiration. Evaporation is not a useful loss of water for agro ecosystems. The other methods could be methods that plant the right crop in the right place. We have done this exercise worldwide, and we see that many of these distribution of crops are suboptimal. And even if we want to preserve nutritional properties of food, but it's possible to change crops to sustain greater yields. At this point, I'm sure I'm running out of time, and these are just very short conclusions that water remains a major constraint on food production, and some countries are in conditions of chronic water deficit, which are reflected by the fact that they cannot produce enough food to feed themselves, and so they are trade dependent. And so these patterns of trade and imports of virtual water are ways in which some countries are able to meet their food need. And the sustainable intensification, so instead of looking for very advanced technological solutions, it's still possible to some extent, to increase or improve the production of food. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and you've shown a lot of information in the form of graphs, but also maps. And as being trained as a geographer, I was quite intrigued by some of them, and I will look at the internet to look at your maps. Obviously, what you put on the table in terms of options can require discussion, and we might come back to that. And as I mentioned, I'm trained as a geographer, and as a geographer, it gives me extreme pleasure to introduce to you one of the ultimate geographers, I would say, Sir Gordon Conway, and the man who, at least for us, doesn't need an introduction. Gordon, let us hear what you want to say to us, and I'm sure you do that from an integrated perspective in which geographers are so strong.
Thank you very much. That's a big challenge. I'm delighted to be back here in Brussels, and I congratulate Isolina Botto persisting in getting me to come here. It's good to be among friends of many kinds, and also new people who I've only just had acquaintance with this breakfast time. It's the right hand. No, it's this one. Sorry. No, yeah, okay. I'll turn that off. Irrigation. Dr. Odereke has given a wonderful conspectus of the whole range of land, water, and energy nexus. I'm going to only take part of this and come at the water demand and supply component, particularly in Africa. First of all, we need to realize that the amount of irrigation in Africa is very small. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. Higher yields depend crucially on irrigation in Africa. There's plenty of water in Africa, but it has to be harnessed. And it can be used on a large or small scale. Then we have to make decisions about that according to the circumstances. It has to be smart, it has to be ingenious, and it means it has to be used precisely and sustainably with resilience. And that is what Dr. Odereke was talking about in terms of sustainable intensification, which I am a great fan of, although I'm not going to talk much about it in detail today. There is plenty of water in Africa. Plenty of water in Africa. These are, you can't see these up close, but these are all the great watersheds, all the great rivers, the Nile, Limpopo, are just some of them, the Congo, of course. Huge amounts of water in Africa. In the Congo, it rains 365 days a year. But the uptake of irrigation in Africa is very small. Just look at that map. You can see the Congo again is virtually no irrigation at all. There is some irrigation in the north, along the Nile, and in the Sudan, and some elsewhere, but it's only 6% of all Africa's arable land is irrigated, and only 4% is irrigated in sub-Saharan Africa. And we also know that climate change is going to have a serious impact on agricultural production in Africa. And you can see the figures up there, the projections of declining yields as a result of climate change. So in Africa, we need more water just to stay put, let alone to increase production. The benefits of irrigation are considerable. They're not really in doubt. We know you can increase productivity with irrigation. Everybody knows that if you give plants water, even those who are just gardeners here in Brussels know that if you give plant water, it grows better. If you don't give it any water, it dies. It's quite straightforward. We all know that. We also know that water is important for women's empowerment. On the one hand, if you don't have easy water available, it produces enormous drudgery in the work of women. But we also know that women can be great exploiters of water. I was in Senegal recently, up in the north along that great river that runs between Senegal and Mauritania, which they've now developed for agriculture in a big way. And one of the groups I went to see was a women's cooperative. And the women were all standing there talking to me, and they switched on the machine that they'd leased, and the machine was producing the rice at the far end, and they took the rice and they put it in bags, and they stamped it with a picture on the bag. And the picture was of the woman who was the head of the cooperative, and so it was called Mother Rice after her. And it went into bags, and the bags then went into trucks that went to a particular neighborhood in Dakar. In other words, they had this link between Dakar and what was happening there in the northeast. What is remarkable is that Senegal is now something like 80% self-sufficient in rice production, whereas it used to import all its rice from India and elsewhere. And I've already talked about the climate risk for irrigation. But finally, we need to talk about job creation. Those cooperatives were creating jobs that I talked about. There's enormous potential to increase agricultural employment through irrigation. And we need to keep bearing that in mind. This diagram is a little bit busy, I'm afraid. I've already talked about the low level of irrigation in Africa. The estimate is that we could go to some 38 million hectares from the current 7.7 million hectares of irrigation. That's all feasible. And that is important to recognize. There are only a small number of countries at the moment with a lot of irrigation. I can't read them here, even there's about 5 countries there. Egypt, the Sahara, even my eyesight.
South Africa, Morocco, and Algeria.
Better eyesight there. So there's only those countries that have got much irrigation, and the rest of Africa could easily adopt a great deal more. There are opportunities in small-scale irrigation, which are, of course, labor heavy, but not necessarily overbearing. There's ways in which you can produce irrigation on a small scale which can be done without a great deal of labor. but you have to be efficient about it. There's also large-scale irrigation. And of course, we have to recognize that large-scale irrigation has got a bad name because of failures in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world. Large-scale irrigation is out of favor now. I remember when I was working in Thailand and elsewhere, there was major investment going on in irrigation. A lot of it was really very well organized. I remember in northern Thailand, the government put in a new irrigation system, but the water was only brought to the edge of the traditional village irrigation system. That was very important. So the villagers had control over the water that they received. And that was a good, sustainable system of irrigation with the community heavily involved. And we need those kind of systems in Africa. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of investment in irrigation going on now because it's believed that irrigation is always destructive of the environment in one way or another. And there are, however, a lot of innovative techniques. You can see them up there. Drip irrigation, center pivot irrigation, floppy sprinklers. I'm not quite sure what a floppy sprinkler is, but I shall find that out. Somebody will tell me what a floppy sprinkler is. Soil sensors, hyperspectral cameras, and so on. These are all in the report that we have just recently produced on irrigation. So there's a lot of potential technologies, a lot of potential application of irrigation around the world. But there are considerable barriers in terms of infrastructure, skills development, land tenure, access to finance. One of the most important is access to finance. This, of course, is true throughout Africa. African governments, by and large, are not very good at accessing finance. It's got better. You find that the Chinese are very good at accessing international finance. They have bureaucracies in their governments who know how to write all the proposals and to get the money that they need. And this is a real problem in Africa. You can see one way of getting the money is through public-private partnerships. The Green Climate Fund has a great deal of money, and there are some applications of it, but certainly not enough. And trying to unleash all that money in Africa, I think, is a goal that's well worth pursuing. We've also looked at a number of examples of irrigation in different countries. So, for example, we've got about, in our report, we've got about 7 or 8 countries that we've looked at. One is small-scale irrigation success in Niger, coming about because of this accelerated development and poverty reduction strategy, and another strategy of small irrigation in 2015. So it's important that countries have these well-developed strategies. But what I really want to talk about is what's happening in Ethiopia. Some of you may remember that we had an earlier report on nutrition. And we discovered, I'll tell a quick story here. We were planning our work in Berlin, and Agnes Kalibata was across the table from me, and I said to Agnes, "You've got 40% stunting in Rwanda. What are you doing about it?" And Agnes turned around to me and said, "That's not true," she said. "It's only 22%, and we are doing a great deal." I said, "Well, what are you doing?" And she said, "We are getting the government departments of all the different ministries to work together and they work together in a way that reports direct to the president of Rwanda. And that's the way you get change. And we then promoted that, and many other countries adopted it around nutrition. And the same applies here for water and other aspects. You'll see we have something called the Agricultural Transformation Agency, set up in Ethiopia, I think it must be about 5 years ago or more.
About 10 years.
Hmm?
About 10 years ago.
It was about 10 years ago. Now, I remember it being set up. I thought it was not so long ago. But this is a really important agency because you see it brings together the Ministries of Finance, the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Water, Irrigation, and Electricity. And the Transformation Agency is chaired by the Prime Minister. That's what's crucial about something like this. If you just have cross committees and so on, and nobody in charge who really has got power, nothing happens. It's one of the great lessons that we've learnt more recently. You can be very good at technology, and I'm a technologist, but in the end, what changes the world is the organizational aspect, and this is a very good example of institutional innovation. We have talked about a whole range of smart irrigation strategies, and they, of course, need funding. And my last slide here is just to illustrate the work. The Malibu-Montpellier panel has been in existence now for 5 years or so. I created the Montpellier panel 10 years ago, called Montpellier because we met in Montpellier, not for any other reason, but I love Montpellier anyway. And we created the panel then, and its purpose was to try and persuade European donors to do a better job of supporting agriculture in Africa. And that's when I used to come a lot to the European Union because I regarded you as a big donor, and we talked to other donors too. And then we transformed it into the Malibu-Montpellier panel to have a much more African focus. And so Ousmane Badiane in Senegal is one of the chairs, and Joachim von Braun is another chair, and the members of the panel are nearly all African. There's only a few that are not. And it really focuses on persuading African governments to do a better job of supporting agriculture. And part of that is persuading African agriculture, other ministers, to do a better job of supporting irrigation. The Waterwise is the report on irrigation. There's a few copies outside, but you can download it just by going to mamopanel.org. And the latest report came out only last week, called Bite by Bite, which is the complement to your irrigation, to your digitalization report. And I'm delighted that that's come out. Unfortunately, I don't have any hard copies here, but you can download them as well. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Gordon. And we'll certainly look again at your reports and see how we can take the recommendations forward also in the European Commission. Let's move to our third speaker, Craig Hanson. Welcome. You really come from across the ocean. And you work at the World Resources Institute, and one of the things that you did is co-authoring the World Resources Report, Creating Sustainable Food Future. And I guess that has a lot of connections with water and energy. So the word is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and good morning to all of you. As mentioned, I'm Craig Hanson. I'm Vice President overseeing food, forest, water, and the ocean at the World Resources Institute. It's a busy day I have with that spectrum there. I'm here to talk about, set a bit of context in this discussion. Some of this you probably already know, and some of it I know is new. And it really kind of sets back to the headline for this whole session around the nexus issues as it particularly relates to a sustainable food future. And that's where I'd like to begin. About 6 months ago, WRI, along with the World Bank, UN Environment, United Nations Development Program, and then 2 French agriculture research agencies, INRA and CIRCAD, published a report called Creating a Sustainable Food Future, which really seeks to answer the question you see there on the screen, how can the world feed nearly 10 billion people by the year 2050 in a manner that advances economic development, but also reduces the food system's pressure on the environment, namely water, climate, and ecosystem is basically the nexus here. And we think this is actually like one of the biggest questions of the next 40 years. And if humanity successfully answers that question, right, we have a chance for a prosperous future. We will have succeeded in addressing the nexus issues. If we fail to successfully answer that question, you're going to have more places where people aren't adequately fed, more degradation of natural ecosystems and scarcity of water, greater contribution to climate change, and I would argue greater risks of conflict. We did not do this alone. As I mentioned here on the screen, these are our partners. We're actually in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C. If you happen to be there, we are actually launching the full detailed technical analyses that actually underpin this synthesis report. One thing we highlighted here, and I'm going to get to the nexus in a second, but this, in my view, really helps set up a discussion around the nexus, is that as we identify there's 3 big gaps when it comes to achieving a sustainable food future. First is what we call the food gap. That's the amount of food that's actually produced today versus the amount of food, given everything else being equal, the business as usual trends going forward, what the food demands of a planet of nearly 10 billion people would be in the year 2050. That's greater than a 50% increase in food that needs to be, 50% increase in terms of food needed. And that especially as previous commentators talked about, the shifting diets that's actually occurring now as well. As nations become more developed, it becomes a more resource intensive, land and water and climate intensive types of diets. The second gap is what we call the land gap. And my 2 predecessors here also highlighted this issue of intensification versus extensification. Current models show that if we continue with business as usual, continuing with the current pace of yield growth, etc., we're going to need somewhere almost like 600 million more hectares of land converted into agriculture. These are natural ecosystems, tropical forests, tropical savannas in particular. 2/3 of it actually for pasture land, as we eat more meat on the planet, will be needed. But if you look at the Paris Agreement and all the IPCC models and what all the climate folks are telling us is we basically need to stop land conversion pretty darn soon if we're actually going to achieve the Paris Agreement. Otherwise, we're having much greater greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, as well as not only to say the impact on biodiversity from the IPBES report that came out about 2 months ago, ringing the alarm bell on biodiversity loss, with land use change being the major driver of that. So we have a land gap. How do you actually feed the planet without converting more land into agriculture? Big question. And finally comes the greenhouse gas emissions gap. Today, the agriculture system, the food system plus land use change, most of that land use change coming from agriculture, is about 25% of global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Business as usual, it's going to grow. Total emissions will go up a lot. The land use and agriculture emissions will go from 12 gigatons up to 15. If we want to stay below 2 degrees, though, what the Paris Agreement says we need to stay under, you need to get agriculture and land use emissions down to 4 gigatons or lower. That's basically an 11 gigaton gap. Now, we actually think there's actually a solution here. What we identify in our report is what we call the menu for a sustainable food future. We look at demand side measures, things like reducing food loss and waste that I believe my preceding commentators talked about. Also shifting diets that the Eat Lancet report actually put a lot of emphasis on as well. But also we need to boost yields but in a sustainable intensification kind of a way, as Sir Gordon Conway was talking about. You know, boosting yields, increasing crop yields, increasing even livestock yields, which I would argue livestock is one of the overlooked elements of the food system. How do you get more meat and milk per existing hectare from livestock that we have? Then also there's the greenhouse gas emissions that are remnant. You know, no matter, you know, whatever happens in terms of the cattle population, cows still emit methane. So how do you actually reduce that methane? Rice still emits methane. How do you reduce the emissions from rice? Fertilizer, the unused fertilizer applied to fields releases nitrous oxides. How can we increase the nitrogen utilization efficiency of the agricultural system? And then finally, there's the restoration agenda that's needed to actually bring us below. This is what we call the menu for a sustainable food future. And embedded in this menu are a host of nexus issues on land, on energy, on water. And just let me highlight a few of those for you. And we need to address these issues if we're going to be successful in this vision for 2020. This is 2050. This chart looks easy. It's actually really hard. Each one of those is require a colossal amount of effort from the public sector, the private sector, and everyone from farmers to consumers to play their role. First is the food and land nexus, right? One thing we've identified in our analysis is that the world is amidst a race for land, right? Yeah. If we don't boost yields, if we don't shift demand, the current trends show that you can have a 56% increase in crop demand between 2010 and 2050, 68% increase in meat and dairy, even higher for beef and lamb. Therefore, a 200 million hectare projected increase in cropland, demand for cropland, and 400 million hectares for grazing land that you saw on my slide before. But at the same time, demand for timber products is going up, right? Will we need 250 million hectares more of a land for timber plantations? There's expansion, more than 100 million hectares of projected demand in terms of urban areas. A lot of that urban growth is on flat, good agricultural land, currently on the margins of urban areas in the global south. As those cities grow into those areas, it actually takes good agricultural land out of production, thereby putting greater pressure on agricultural expansion elsewhere. So there is a race for land on the planet. This land and food nexus is central. Secondly, as the first speaker talked a lot about, there's this food-water nexus issue. Withdrawals, anywhere from 70 to 85% of global water withdrawals are for water. And then if you look at where water is actually being used for agriculture, a lot of it is already in water-stressed areas. WRI's work with our global mapping and monitoring of global water stress called Aqueduct, what we find is that 28% of all cropland is already in highly water-stressed areas. If you look at the irrigated areas, it's about 56% of irrigated cropland is in already water-stressed areas. So there is this water-food nexus issue that the first speaker went in a lot more detail than I'm doing here on this. And Gordon Conway talked a lot about actually ways to actually address that. There's also, though, the food and energy nexus. If you look at, this is a chart on the left-hand side, this is global greenhouse gas emissions in the year 2010, about 49 gigatons. About 13% of global emissions come from agriculture directly, another 11% from land use change. But of that portion for agriculture production, about 17%, so about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions is energy used, emissions from energy used to produce food, right? This is the tractors and energy used to make nitrogen fertilizer, et cetera. And so there is a food energy nexus issue to be addressed as well, especially when it comes to the climate change challenge. There's also the land energy nexus. There's been conversations today a bit about bioenergy and biofuels. We did an analysis working with some of our research partners at, well, how much of the harvested biomass on the planet would it actually take to generate a certain amount of energy? And so we looked at data from the year 2000, looked at all the human harvested biomass on the planet, all the crops, all the crop residues, all the grasses that our livestock eat, and all the wood that we produce for making anything from toilet paper to houses, right? And if you actually converted that into energy, into heat and or electricity and or transportation fuel using the best efficiencies that are out there today, it could at best generate 20% of the world's projected global primary energy use in the year 2050. Let me just take that in for a moment. That is all the biomass we use for everything else, right? Gets you max, maybe 20% of global primary energy use in 2050. We still need livestock, we still need crops, we still need timber, we still like toilet paper, we still need all this other stuff. So how much land is it going to take to recreate all that? So one thing we highlight is the land implications of going very heavy on biomass for energy. We have to be really smart on how we do that, otherwise we're going to create even more demand, right, on already scarce land resources when it comes to the nexus here in land and energy. There's also the water energy nexus. We do a lot of work, after agriculture, the next biggest use of the world's water, the fresh water, is on energy generation. And about 70% of the world's energy generation is some form of fossil generation. Most fossil, as well as nuclear systems, use water for actually cooling, right? And then there's hydro that obviously is water converted, into using turbines into energy. And we're increasingly seeing instances where the scarcity of water is actually impacting energy generation, from places like the United States to Kenya to India, where the lack of the drop in reservoirs, the lack of reductions in water actually causes the shutdown of thermoelectric plants, right? Because there's not enough water there to cool them. We did an analysis looking at the country of India for a 4-year period, 2013 to year 2016, and we calculated how much electricity generation was basically foregone. They had to shut down plants because of a lack of sufficient water for cooling, right? There was basically 30 terawatt hours, right, which is the amount of energy to power, I believe, Sri Lanka for an entire year, right, was lost in India over a 4-year period. When this data hit the headlines of India, it basically caused a lot of rethinking about where they place their power plants and the water security or insecurity of where they place their power plants, because it drives home the point that your energy generation is heavily influenced by the availability of fresh water, and you can't ignore that. And so when you look at places and thinking about, countries are thinking about where they place their next electricity generation plants, they have to look at the water implications, because you could end up like India and have lots of shutdowns that leads to lots of economic and power losses. We're not the only ones that are highlighting these issues of the nexus as being fundamental. The 2018 Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum comes out every year. They ask a bunch of the world's CEOs, what do you worry about? Look at the upper right-hand corner. These are things of high likelihood and high impact. A lot of those headline terms are what we're talking about today. So you guys aren't far off in terms of these are the important issues. We don't see it here. The CEOs of the planet see it. It's climate change, failure of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, water crises, food crises, extreme weather events, which actually also impact the nexus issues. Finally, I've talked a lot here about the context and looking back. One thing we're doing here at WRI is trying to help the world look forward and predict and be better prepared for issues at the nexus and thereby being able to prevent conflict that can occur when the nexus goes bad, right? We have a project, a big initiative. We're working with the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, with the Dutch government, IHE Delft, and a few others, to really help build an early warning system to predict conflict that arises due to the failure in some of these nexus issues. It's not out yet. It was actually mentioned a couple weeks ago in an Economist report. It's an early warning system. This portion of it I'm going to show you here is triggered mostly around water, but we also look at other factors as well. And what we do with this, and we've done some studies here. We're still working with artificial intelligence. We're ingesting big data, lots of data. This is data on precipitation, data on crop production, data on reservoir extraction, population movement, social issues, the level of religious or ethnic tension already in the area, demographic movements. We're looking at evapotranspiration. We're crunching a lot of data, and then trying to see to what degree can we predict the outbreak of conflicts, right, around natural resources. We've done a number of pilot tests. This one here we did in Mali. We're at about 85% accuracy. What we're missing is false negatives, meaning that we didn't pick up stuff that actually happened, but we did have a pretty good hit rate on picking up stuff that actually did happen using our algorithm. We're still working with it. We want to get to 95% or above accuracy. We have about another year's worth of work on this one, working with folks working on basically the artificial intelligence, and we're playing with the data input. And the beauty of this, one thing that's unique about this, is we're not looking at conflict, predicting it 5 years or 10 years from now, right? We're looking at within 12 months and at the county level, right? The sub-provincial county or district level within any country. So we're going pretty high resolution, quite near term, within 12 months conflict resolution. We think that there's a future in this. We're big believers in technology, like Gordon Conway. We believe that there's a future in artificial intelligence to be able to, we're not scared of it. We think actually we can harness it. And the game is to figure out with enough data inputs at high resolution, right, we can get pretty close to providing that early warning system for conflict at the nexus, which fundamentally will be important for addressing the sustainable food future. So with that, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Greg, for giving us a picture that was much clearer than when we entered this building this morning. Unfortunately, not all is rosy, but you also gave us a menu, and the menu of a number of solutions around technological changes and around pathways of addressing some of these challenges. And I guess that is one of the issues that we have to heed. Your menu was a little bit in fine print, but I'm sure that your report is showing it a bit bigger, yes. The last speaker of the first panel is, and I'm very glad to say so, our colleague Veronica Girardi, working for the European Commission in the unit that deals with environmental issues, and she specifically specializes on the water questions, but she's talking today about the water, energy, agricultural nexus and the specific program that we have, that we're implementing along with the Germans. Veronica.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Wim. I'm really glad to be here today with these distinguished speakers and having the chance to present the Nexus Dialogue program. But before talking about this program, I would like to go back 1 second to the approach that is at the basis of this program, so the Nexus Approach. As already mentioned by Leonard and other speakers, the Nexus Approach supports an holistic and sustainable management of resources, highlighting the complex interdependencies among the water, energy, and food sectors in light of global challenges such as population growth and climate change, for instance. But sometimes the Nexus Approach is not very well understood and is confused or perceived like a revisitation of the integrated water resource management approach. The reality is that there are quite a number of differences between the two. Like, for example, while EWRM in the EWRM, the objective is achieving water use efficiency and sustainability. For the Nexus, it's an overall resource use efficiency and addressing externalities across sectors. Or again, another difference, the focus. In EWRM, water is at the center, while in the Nexus Approach, and the meeting of today is an example of this, depending on the perspective, water, energy, or food or land can be at the core. This misperception of the Nexus brings us at one of the reasons why we decided to have our Nexus Dialogue program. This program has been a joint initiative of the EU and the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, and has the clear scope to promote and mainstream the water, energy, food Nexus approach at global, regional, and national level in order to enhance the understanding of this approach, and also to break the silos often existing between ministries dealing with these three different sectors. The first phase of the program started in 2016 and will finish at the end of this year, 2019. The regional dialogue of the Nexus are implemented by three different partner organizations that are GIZ, Global Water Partnership, and CAREC. CAREC is an environmental NGO based in Kazakhstan and with a regional mandate. The dialogues are in 5 regions across the world. GIZ is covering Latin America region, the MENA region, and the Niger Basin region, while Global Water Partnership is focusing on Southern Africa and CAREC on Central Asian countries. Each of these regions had a different starting point in the discussion because some of those were more advanced, like I would say the Southern African one, and others were lagging behind. So for instance, in Central Asia, we had to start the discussion at a national level in order to bring awareness, and only once the different member states were convinced of this approach, bring the discussion to a regional level. The local partners of this program are the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLAC, the League of Arab States, the Niger Basin Authority, the Southern Africa Development Community, and the International Fund for Saving the RLC. So some of them are multi-sectoral organization, others are basin-oriented organization, and we work in close cooperation with all these organizations in 2 of the 4 pillars, let's say, of the Nexus Dialogue program, that are mainly the human capacity development pillar and the activities and pilot project pillar, that are indeed developed at national and regional level, while the other 2 pillars, knowledge exchange and networking, and Nexus Resource Platform, are more at a global scale. The 2 global pillars are ensured by GIZ through the Global Nexus Secretariat, who aims at supporting global dialogue on the Nexus and to improve knowledge management on this topic. For instance, through the development of Nexus training courses to be held in the different regions, and the identification of Nexus principles and indicators, but also with the management of the Nexus Resource Platform that is accessible to everyone at the address www.water-energy-food.org, and where you can find reports, articles from the research community on this specific topic. Besides this, there are other actions implemented at regional level. I will focus today for benefit of time, on 2 of those that are the 2 sub-Saharan components of the program. In the Niger Basin, the program has been implemented in strong cooperation, as I already said, with the Niger Basin Authority, and the activities immediately started with a regional scope, because the partner organization brings together 9 countries of the Sahel region. Among the outcomes achieved in this region, we can mention the mainstreaming of the Nexus approach in the investment plan of NBA, and the analysis of the Niger Basin Authority operational plan for the period 2016-2024 in a Nexus perspective. but more concretely also the introduction of the Nexus approach in a large-scale project in Guinea, that is the Fomi Dam. In the Southern Africa region, the program has been implemented in a strong cooperation with SADC, that was one of the partners that was more advanced in the Nexus thinking, and already had a chapter dedicated to water, energy and food Nexus in its strategic plan. Here the dialogue has been developed both at regional and national level. For instance, through activities like a national Nexus perspective paper that has been prepared for each of the 15 SADC countries, and a Nexus project identification tool that has been developed. This has facilitated one of the outcomes of this first phase, that is common to all the 5 regions included in our program, and that is to say a list of Nexus priority projects for each region to be possibly financed in the second phase of the program. Now that we are almost at the end of this first phase of the program, we can affirm that there is no blueprint for the implementation of the Nexus approach, and that each region has its own context and different focuses areas. But the benefit of the approach is definitely similar in all of these regions. An important point is also that regional authorities should have the trust and respect of the member states, as well as the mandate to bring different sectors together for discussion. Indeed, national objectives and focus areas are still often higher prioritized, and this might not coincide and not be compatible with a Nexus approach. But when there is ownership of this approach at regional level, we have seen that things have greater margin of improvement. For all these reasons, the EU remains convinced of the value of this approach and wants to support further this program in a second phase to start in 2020. And aim at continuing the dialogue process in the different regions, but also moving from theoretical to concrete and tangible benefits of the Nexus approach through project preparation and implementation. I finish here, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Veronica. And with those 4 presentations, I would like to start opening the floor for questions, comments, extra viewpoints. And while I don't see immediate, yes, I see one hand, 2 more hands. There are 3. Okay, good. There are many hands. One point that I wanted to give to the panel as something to ponder about is when we have to look at the nexus and the 3 factors around energy, food, and land. There are also questions around prices and incentives for using the 3 factors. And one of the slides that Paula showed was about the unsustainable use of water, including in Western India. Part of the problem there is as well the subsidized energy for the pumps on irrigation, which becomes an entrenched pattern and very difficult to change. So something to ponder about. But let me first throw open. I saw 3 hands and 1 lady of the 3. If I'm not mistaken, it's Katerina, isn't it? Yes, we start with Katerina.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Good morning, my name is Katharina Mieder. I work for GIZ, and we're currently, hi there, in my face. And we're currently, on behalf of BMZ, actually preparing a new initiative, which is called Water and Energy for Food, together with our partners CEDA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands and USAID. With the goal to produce more food and using less water and less energy in the process. And the concept is based on two ongoing initiatives, which you might be familiar with, Powering Agriculture and Securing Water for Food, which have been running for the last 5 years or so. And based on the lessons learned, we're now setting up this new program, which I would briefly like to highlight here, just because I think it fits very well into the discussions and the presentations we just heard. And it has a bit of a different focus. So basically our core, the core of the program is actually to work with the private sector, specifically focusing on startups and small companies. And the idea is to fund innovative ideas at the interface of energy, water, and agriculture, or food, the interface of water and food, and the interface of energy and food. So for us, it's not always all three sectors, but also two would work as long as food is in there. And there the idea is to support those companies financially, but also technically, to make them investment ready, because we see that access to finance for companies that do promote and scale innovative ideas at the interface of water and energy and food is something that is lacking out there. But we also, based on the lessons learned from the former two initiatives, see that scaling of innovations can not only be done by private sector, but there are a couple of bottlenecks that we identified. One is end-user financing. The second one is unfavorable enabling environment and knowledge gaps. So those three bottlenecks we are also planning to tackle in the new initiative. And again, hold on a second. So this is just a very brief outline because I don't want to hijack the discussion here. Geographically, activities will actually, so it's a global project, and activities will take place or will be steered through regional hubs, two in Africa, one in East Africa, one in West Africa, one in Southeast Asia, and one in the MENA region. And something I also want to highlight is that we're currently in talks with the DESIRA colleagues, if this is a project that might also or could fit into the DESIRA framework. So thank you, that was it.
Thanks, Katharina, and we'll certainly from our side keep on following this, and but it will be good that somehow we exchange how the lessons that we can draw from all these projects can be shared. To other, Michel first, and then we had hand there.
Thank you, Michel Lavolée, Public-Private Partnerships Europe. The first point I wanted to make was actually made by our colleague from GIZ. In the list of SDGs that Leonard mentioned, I think SDG 17 should clearly be part of the mix, so partnerships, and Gordon insisted on PPPs. The other point I want to make is that there's, I believe there should be more of a sense of urgency in not just talking about risk, but how you de-risk the situations, and looking at presentations on Mali by Craig, the other presentation on the Niger Basin. If you compare these studies and assessments to what happened in the Idai situation in Africa, there's clearly a need for immediate response mechanisms and de-risking mechanisms. Michael mentioned index insurance and things like that, but I think that considering the degradation of food security in certain parts of Africa, I think there should be more of a sense of immediate action that is possible to actually prevent. And one of the proposals we're discussing with many of the stakeholders is strengthening the data systems in the poorer regions of Africa, including weather data, multi-purpose, a Nexus approach. Thanks.
Thank you. On the left-hand side, and with the glasses first, yes. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Professor Linson. I'm a neuroscientist, very much interested in education tomorrow and governance of tomorrow. Actually, it's a question I could ask at the end of the session. I'm wondering what's going to be the practical takeaway that the panel is going to suggest to the audience for concrete action. I have the impression everything is still so disconnected, so fragmented, with a complete lack of coordination. I mean, the Paris agreements were flawed to begin with at the very start, precisely because of a lack of a new global governance infrastructure to implement them. Many researchers and academics, and I thought of this when I listened to Paolo's presentation, they also recognize the need for a tool to facilitate coordinated multi-stakeholder collaboration worldwide. And this is my suggestion. So I have the impression that we are still going around circles without any concrete impact whatsoever. Thank you.
Right, two more questions, and then we have many. I'll take two more, and then we go to the panel, and then we go through a second round. We just follow the.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President, for that. My question is directed to Veronica Girardi. She talked of the need to break silos in ministries, which I do agree, in dealing with water, energy, and agriculture. But what she did not tell us is what she talked of as tangible benefits, concrete benefits. Can you tell us what they are, so that we can benefit from them? And then I also want to direct a question to Sir Gordon. You talked about agricultural transformation agencies in Ethiopia and Rwanda, and you said these are good models, and I agree with you. You talked about institutional innovation. So can you tell us of any demonstrable impact of having such an agency which can be replicated, so that we can replicate it in other countries like Kenya? And I forgot, by the way, my name is Professor Kaimenyi, the Kenyan ambassador to Kenya. And finally, again, Sir Gordon, you don't indeed talk about the fact that African countries are not good at accessing international finance. I want to beg to hear from you. What is the reason or reasons behind this, and what can be done? Thank you.
Very clear questions. Thank you, Ambassador. One more question, and then we go. So we just, yes, indeed.
Yes, good morning. My name is Simon. This will not be a question, but a compliment to the panel. In terms of quality, I become a frequent flyer to the CTA events, Mrs. Botto and President Hailu. I'm here to represent investors. We launched a startup project worldwide with private funds to support ECP cooperation and development projects. We have selected Trinidad Tobago and the Caribbean. We have selected 2 countries in Africa, Sierra Leone and Madagascar. I've been to Sierra Leone 3 times over the last 6 months, and we are now activating a memorandum of understanding with the Minister of Agriculture, as promised to the President when we was here last year in October. I just want to give the opportunity to all those experts, representatives of NGOs, new initiatives in Europe, outside Europe, to come and join us in activating private, if needed, private-public projects in wonderful countries with wonderful new presidents, with wonderful new administrations, top educated people who are just waiting for us, all of us here, to come and support their agriculture projects. We have put option on 180,000 hectares of rice in Sierra Leone. They are working for more than 6 years to try to activate that project. They never thought about asking to Europe, private and public professionals in Europe, to help them. This is now starting as from next week. Thank you.
Thank you for the information. And I take it that when you do your RISE project, that you look very well at the nexus we are discussing here today. But now the word to the panel, and I would like to go in the order of the presentations. So starting with Paulo, and please pick the elements that you think, yes, that's where I need to react to, plus of course the direct questions that were given to you. Yes.
Thank you. Well, there were, first of all, I have to say that I'm not used to this type of format of conferences, so I'm more used to academic format. So there were not many questions to begin with. There were more comments or remarks or things that other people in the room are doing, which sound interesting, but I don't know enough of what you are doing to comment on. There was an interesting point that came up from your questions, let's call them questions. The fact of what is the concrete action, the idea that we are moving in a circularity and not hitting the right point. I think it's the studies that have been done in the last few years have stressed at least what are the constraints on the system, what are the linkages, and have clarified a little bit better how the food and water security and energy security are related to one another. So I think that is seems to be a little bit still academic, but it's I think an important step in the direction of at least recognizing the problem. I think this is also what was emerging from the other presentations today, and the fact itself that I say the humanity thought that the food problem would have not been a problem during the Green Revolution because of the invention of industrial fertilizers. And then we forgot that there are two other important constraints which are discussed about today. So the land and water are the main ones. And then there are all the other aspects that are more on the institutional economic side. So I think what we realized when there were emerging new food crises in 2008 and 2011 is that there are these factors are there and they are related, and we have exceeded these boundaries for the sustainable use of resources. If we look at energy, we look at food, and so that's the first thing. The one point we haven't touched was, I think, a little bit maybe in Craig's presentation, the fact that when we look at solutions to the food problems, we tend to look at always at solutions in the direction of increasing productions. Instead, there are other points that are more the solutions in the direction of reducing or moderating consumption. This goes back to the discussion we had on waste, or the discussion we had also on dietary choices and so on. Clearly, that's something that emerges as a direction of possible action. Then this at least shows from the physical or biophysical point of view the constraints that we are working on. There are many other aspects I'm not competent to discuss about, which are related more to the institutional, political, and economic aspects of the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. And Sir Gordon, you are certainly well versed on the institutional side, and you also had a specific question from the Kenyan ambassador about the transformation agency, but if maybe also Dr. Hailu can say some words about the transformation agencies.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the questions was from Professor Eleni. there is the issue about getting the finances to Africa. I think the challenge is for African governments to set up specific groups within their government that become expert at putting forward the proposals to get funds from the big funds. It may be, the Chinese are very good at it. They get a lion's share of all this money. They've just got very good civil services that know how to write the documents and how to get them through. It might be a good idea, if you're setting one up in African countries, to send somebody to China and see how they're doing it. But it's a question of getting the right little bureaucracy in your government that really is good at getting this money. And that hasn't really happened so much. The other issue is about the cross-departmental groups that we have been looking at and helping to set up, first of all, in nutrition and secondly in irrigation. Many of those have been actually very successful. The Agricultural Transformation Agency, which is the oldest of these groupings, has been very successful in bringing about agricultural change in Africa. The trick, I think, is, well, just to say it again, the trick is, first of all, to bring all the relevant ministries together. Secondly, to make sure that they report and have to report to either the Prime Minister or the President. That's absolutely crucial. And thirdly, I think it's quite important, and I haven't said this, to have a clear focus of what you want to achieve by that group. So in the case of malnourishment, of nutrition, it was to reduce stunting rates. And we can see in many parts of Africa, stunting rates are really going down. And it's in part because of the creation of these cross-government committees. In the case of irrigation, I'm not quite sure what that focus should be. It should be something to do with precision and sustainability. And I want to look again at what we've written to see how clearly we've made a focus in there too. So it's on the one hand, this is the trick, of course. It's on the one hand, you're bringing all these different people together. And you have this with the Nexus report, of course. The Nexus work you're doing. You're trying to bring a whole lot of people together. And it's very difficult bringing a lot of people together to make them work together. And at the same time, you've got to have some kind of clear focus that's deliverable and that you can measure. Stunting is a very good one when it comes to nourishment. You can see the reduction in stunting. In irrigation, I'm not quite so sure what it is. I'm going to have to read our report and see if we've got it in there. And I'll come back to you if that's the case.
Thank you. Craig, what would you like to add?
Certainly. There was a question about governance and with the lack of a global governance. What do you do with all these? And interestingly enough, I mean, I would argue, sadly, you look at the current political situation on the planet, we're actually moving further and further away from the ability to create global governance. There's a rise in nationalism. And so I would argue, you can't wait for the political tides to turn. I do believe they will turn, but I think the urgency of the issues we face today are such we can't say, well, let's wait until you get good global institutions back in place and good global governance, and then we'll deal with these. I think you have to figure what's the second best option given the existing systems in place. So how do you tap into national self-interest and national systems, right, in important agricultural countries, for instance, to get the innovations going, get the changes in the national level of governance so you can actually you can answer some of these nexus issues. At the same time, there is the public-private partnership. The private sector is increasingly interested, right, in these issues. Some of the big multinationals and emerging continental-based companies are interested in these issues. They're providing solutions, they have the financial wherewithal, etc. How do you tap into them and the coalitions of the willing that are forming on certain commodities or on certain issues, right? And then finally, there is this thing called the internet and free tools and systems out there that in a magical kind of way starts to kind of bring people together off of a common platform. It's a different type of governance. I don't know if the term's been invented yet, but even like what I was showing with the, if we're successful in our conflict prediction type of system, right? That's going to be free. It'll be out there. It becomes a tool that multiple people don't have to sit in a room together to have a formal agreement, but they can use in a kind of a shared reality that I think can actually help with driving some how we actually address some of these issues. Please, I don't know.
Thank you. No reaction at this stage. There will be a moment during the break. Yeah. Okay, good. There was still a question to Veronica. Please.
Yes, actually I will pick two of the questions. The first one that it was directed to me concerning the tangible benefits of this kind of action and this kind of approach. In my opinion, the importance of breaking the silos is because this would allow to think in advance. So I will give you a concrete example, the first that comes to my mind. In Africa, there are many dams for hydropower. So already in this dam, there is a double component for water and energy to be taken into consideration. But if they, in the discussion, since the beginning of the planning of these kind of dams, the agriculture sector, the agriculture stakeholders would also be involved, probably the irrigation dimension could also be embedded in the project. That is a thing that often comes to our desks to see that then there is a request for a rehabilitation of a part of the dam and inclusion of additional opportunities for irrigation. So if the thinking is already there, if the discussion takes place at the beginning among all the different sectors, breaking the silos, we can avoid time, save money, and have better results, from my point of view. And the other point that I wanted to pick is the one on strengthening data systems. I fully agree on this observation, and it's very important to have data for evidence-based policy decision. And I can tell you that the EU is taking this into consideration in almost all the projects that we have. Leonard, in his opening remarks, mentioned a program that we have in cooperation with the Nile Basin Institution for supporting the management of the Nile River Basin, and also the Senegal project. And both these projects have a component for strengthening data system and data analysis.
Thank you. From the side here, from the panel, still a reaction by Leonard Mitzi. Okay.
So I thank all the panelists. I think it's clear. The analysis, we know what the problems and issues are. I heard WRI. I was in The Hague with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs last week, and there was also a reference to a study that FOLU, which is the Food and Land Use Coalition, are going to publish in a few weeks' time, transforming food, land use and systems. They will also look into what Wim mentioned, the equity dimension, because I think equity is important. Growth is fine, and we want the 8% growth. We will not get more 8%, 10% growth in Africa. We will have to get used to 3 and 4% growth. But it has to be also inclusive and equitable growth. And there are so many distortions in the land, water, energy nexus that we need also to factor that in. One of the problems of private sector is that the food, agricultural, and including water and irrigation system is so complex that de-risking it is even more complex than other projects. Because let's be clear, money is there. There are trillions of funds out there and impact funds. But they are looking for bankable projects. And that is, I think, what is going to be the big challenge of this new commission. Yesterday we have had the election or the proposal of a new commission president. So things will start settling down gradually and will start moving into business. I think it's also that this event should come up with some guiding areas of where these solutions on bankability of the private sector could be in the land, water, energy nexus. Because we are experiencing this just on the agriculture, agri-food side, and under the external investment plan, we didn't have many bankable projects. So it's important that with the financial institutions, we see what is bankable. Because I agree, and the professor who spoke about governance, and Craig mentioned it, it's good that we speak about what you mentioned, national self-interests. But in a national self-interest approach in Africa, and I fully agree with Professor Conway, we know where the success stories are. It's the usual 5 to 10 countries. But there are another 40 countries in Africa. I was reading in The Economist recently, or Bloomberg, what's happening in Zimbabwe, what's happening in RDC, what's happening in Burundi, what's happening in Eritrea, what's happening in Djibouti. These issues that we are discussing today have a transboundary dimension. And if it's fine having a national self-interest, that is what we are trying to do in our national indicative program. But in the new programming, we need to look into the regional and trans-regional dimension. Because if we don't do this, conflicts around the land, water, energy nexus will increase. And we are trying to construe under the global network on food crisis some form of governance at the global level with like-minded FAO, WFP, SILS, SICA in Central America. But what is also a priority is national and sub-regional coordination mechanisms. And it's there where we are still not there. Because when you don't have national coordination on early action or early warning, which has a transnational dimension, you can't really intervene with scale. So what is important, I think, that, and I heard all the panelists, is that if you can extract maybe one key recommendation for the new commission in terms of bankability of projects, where you see that there can be a transnational dimension in what we are trying to do also in landscape approaches, but also in terms of governance, we need to get it right. Because yes, fully agree that, and we see it in stunting and in all forms of malnutrition, when you have the highest political buy-in, it works. But what's happening in the regional economic communities, in the RECs? We need to get more work around the RECs. And now that we have the continental free trade area, how can we enhance the governance structure so that the problems around cross-border issues are really tackled cross-border?
Thanks, Leonard. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a traditional chess problem, and that's time. I promised a second round, and at the same time we're running out of time. So my solution is the following. I'll do a second round, but I ask you to be very, very brief in your questions and your remarks, and then we break for lunch after some reactions. Sorry, it's not lunch yet, coffee. The lunch follows later. Professor, I wanted to start with you. As I said, you were not allowed to react yet. Do make a reaction now. We also had Leonard's reaction to you just now. I would like to give you the floor first. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, regarding Sorry? Yeah. Yes, regarding my reaction, new global governance infrastructure. Well, this is precisely what the new capacity building program is setting up now. Blending together what we call the education of tomorrow, the governance of tomorrow, smart cities, life science and medicine. And we are busy working on preparing our Info Week, where we expect something like 260 delegations to prepare the first ever world program on world society, well-being, quality of life, where the deliverable shall precisely be a tool that is so needed by everybody to facilitate coordinated multi-stakeholder collaboration worldwide. In other words, setting up a new global governance infrastructure. Because as I often say, we are faced with a global network of interconnected global challenges that can only be appropriately managed by first setting up a new global governance infrastructure. So I'll get back to you and also other gentlemen in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I suggest you share the details as well with CTA, who can share it in the network. The lady at the second row, please. Please come forward and use a mic in the front row. Yeah. Madame?
Des associations. Thank you very much. I'm from the Women's Association from the Congo here in Belgium. Thank you for all your presentations. We have learned quite a lot, but I think we have not stressed enough the fact that violence, especially gender-based violence in our societies, whether traditional or modern societies, as women are the ones who have to fetch water. This violence prevents them from fetching water like they've been doing for years and years. So I don't think you focus enough on insecurity and violence causing women to not perform their traditional role of fetching water. And this destabilizes the African society. So perhaps you can stress this fact. We clearly see this today. This has to do with the use of resources in Africa. So perhaps you can focus more on violence in Africa that prevents us from developing. Without peace in Africa, there can be no development. Thank you. I trust that you will insist on this issue of insecurity and violence in Africa.
Important dimension. How many questions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4. Okay, we start on the right lady now, please.
Meropi Panelli from DigiDevco, Sustainable Energy and Climate Change. I will make the link with the previous, just the lady that talked about, and with Senegal, Mauritania border, some of the axes. The speakers talk about what it is, the agricultural development and so on. In Mauritania, Senegal borders, there were a lot of violence because of the movement of populations, communities between the two countries because of the lack of food and resources. And through the eco-village approach, for eco-villages, the REDES in Mauritania and so on, they made a pact for peace and they upscale the eco-villages approach for rural sustainable development. And they made as a byproduct of this that they were mind-like thinking. They made also a pact for peace. One example, that an eco-village concept that includes circular economy, that includes electrification of based on sustainable development, micro-irrigation through frugal innovation based on renewable energies, how all these things can simply put in practice for sustainable rural development. Agroecology, green schools, and it passed from education. They have the GEA education that they pass the know-how from village to village. I'm wondering, I heard about we are increasing the meat. Yes, increasing the meat consumption. We are in a point of the planet that environmental concerns are not environmental concerns for the environmental systems. It's a kind of survival of our species, the human species. So I would suggest that in all approaches, the Nexus approach, or whatever we do, is to bringing down the emissions down from all the activities, from energy sector, from things. We are heading 3% right now with the current mode of living. We are heading to 3%, 3 degrees Celsius. In 4 degrees Celsius, the planet becomes uninhabitable. We cannot inhabit the planet. And there are Harvard calculations 10 days ago that they say the possibility that any ice left in the Arctic by 2022, in 3 years' time, is 0. And if this happens, we have 7 meters sea level rise. And we cannot, the ecosystems, the living ecosystems, they work without us, and they will backfire. And if we reach this point, we cannot go back. So the suggestion I have, put the heart in all the activities, go beyond GDP, reduce consumption of everything, of meat. We saw the meat, it produces the environmental footprint of meat production is huge, the water footprint and pollution of meat production. And it has to do at all levels, at political levels, and we as a citizen.
We have more people to speak,
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your contribution. I see one more at 1, 2, and 3, and then I close the list. There's a lady first, then a man, and then another man, yes. A lady on the left-hand side, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Tessa. I work for WWF, the European Policy Office, and I have a question directed to Mr. Hanson from WRI, relating to the relationship between the Eat Lancet report that was also mentioned by other panelists as well, and the nexus we were talking about. When presenting what you call the solutions to close the different existing gaps, you mentioned this shift in diets, but a bit later you talked about a boost in livestock yield and put forward the question on how to get more meat and milk per hectare. So I'm just wondering how you see this coinciding with the Eat Lancet reports that actually is calling for a reduction in the production and consumption of meat and essentially is promoting this plant-based diet. Thank you.
Thanks for the concrete question. Gentleman, just behind, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is David from DevGrad. Just a quick response to Katrina GIZ on your initiative. Not to just to reinvent the wheel. You have the projects just coming up, the energy, water and energy for food. Will it be good, because I do actually notice that you are not engaging whether the governments or be international cooperation together in that project. Will it be good to also consider the integrated food energy system of the FAO, because they have a very similar model? And one of the major problems is what you just actually identified, which is scaling up. So I do work on that project, and I do discover that they have a fantastic model, and we couldn't actually scale the project up, even from the FAO. So if you can actually plug your project to that, that is practical on ground, and I think we can actually bring everything together and have a synergy kind of policy and application. Thank you.
Thank you, and I suggest you take that up in the break afterwards, the two of you. There was a question on the right-hand side. Yes, please.
Just two quick questions, and the first one goes to Sir Gordon. How do you get African governments to prioritize water in all the issues that you're talking about? Because I find that when they're talking about all the projects they talk about during campaigns. It's about roads. It's about all things that have to do with basically nothing to do with most of the common people. How do you make them to prioritize, to raise the level of prioritization of water sources to the same level as borrowing the same funds for road construction? That's the first one. The second is maybe to all the panelists, can we encourage local production more than these big firms producing food for everybody? Because they're producing food that goes circles all over the world and still gets cheaper than food produced next door. How can we encourage local production that is going to benefit local communities more than these multinationals that are killing local production?
Thank you very much. With that, I'll close the questions. I'll go through the panel because we have this last question is a very relevant one. I would like to ask the panel to answer that. It's the issue of local versus local production, local consumption versus more trade related aspects. And all of the panelists will have something to say about that. In addition, there was one question for Gordon Conway, one for Craig. Gordon, I would like to start with you and then go around.
The way we tackle the question that you asked is we have meetings called the Malibu Forum. We had one just recently in Kigali with about I think 3 or 4 ministers and half a dozen senior civil servants around digitization and the digital economy. We're still perfecting this approach, but it does seem to work. We can take a report such as our irrigation one or the digitization report and have a meeting, a one-day meeting with senior government ministers and senior government civil servants to come up with priorities going forward. And we can trace the impact that we've had with those meetings.
Thank you. Watch your glass. Paulo, do you? I would like to ask you to answer a little bit the question about local production and trade. You came up with the trade flows as well in your presentation.
I think there are 2 questions there. First of all, how local can we be? And of course, there is a lot of interest for local food movements in general. And currently, if we look at, we have done this analysis, if we look at the current distribution of agricultural land and what it can produce and distribution of people, we can go clearly more local than what we are doing, but there is still going to be a reliance on global trade because of the fact that there are regions of the world that cannot produce all the food they need. There is the other question is also how we can prevent that global trade runs out of business local farmers. And this is a more complicated thing, which is due to the fact that the food is produced in some other parts of the world with subsidies, and so this runs out of business, and so there are very cheap surpluses, for example, from North America that can be dumped in other countries at a, let's say, very competitive price. I'm not an economist, but this is my understanding of what's happening, and so this is a more complicated question of political economy at the global scale.
That's a subject for a next briefing, I'm sure. Craig, a specific question and the general one, please. If
yeah, sure. Can. So on the specific question from WWF, so remember the question was about, well, Eat Lancet and we ourselves with the World Bank say you got to reduce the amount of red meat in particular consumption, especially not everywhere. I mean, it's especially those that overconsume, right? North Americans, Europe, Brazil, etc. Right? There are some places we're very clear to eat as well. Some places actually need to increase the amount of animal-based consumption, given the lack of nutrients they currently have. Right? So this is not a blanket statement. At the same time, we also say we need to boost yields from pasture land, so you make more meat and milk per pasture. To me, it's a both and an and, right? You can actually, relative to projections, we need to reduce the amount of, both EAT and DBRI with the World Resources Report. We have reduced that growth. But then of those livestock that remain, right, neither of us saying no more livestock, right? The livestock that remain, we need to be boosting the yields per hectare of that, right? And also, too, you can't assume that the diet shift's going to happen. If we just say, well, that's going to happen, therefore don't worry about yields elsewhere, that's a big bet to make, right? Shifting demand's a tough thing to do. And so no regrets is to the boost of the yields of the existing livestock we've got at the same time. So it's both and. On the trade, I agree with the professor around, you can go local only so far, but there's some places you're still going to need trade.
Veronica, some final thoughts from your side? No specific question. Okay, with that, let's go for a break. 10-minute coffee break. We resume.
So please, if you can have a seat. Thank you very much. That our chair can restart session 2, please. Can you help him by sitting? We still have a lunch after that, so you still can finish the conversation. Please, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back after the coffee break. Indeed, so we have a second panel, again with 4 panelists, and all the 4 panelists have 10 to 15 minutes, I'm afraid, this time, because we have to end at 1 o'clock. And the panelists take us from space and the Netherlands to Ghana, to Ethiopia, and to South Africa. And we will be looking at a number of concrete issues around Nexus questions of food, land, and water. So starting in the Netherlands, Ruud Krim, who is working for the Netherlands Space Office, will look from above and tell us something about his views on the Nexus challenges. Ruud, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. And I work with the Netherlands Space Agency, and as indeed we look from above with a lot of satellites. European Commission, in fact, is financing the Copernicus satellite constellation, which is providing free and open data. And a lot of this information is made, let's say, it is transformed into information and knowledge which is actionable. It's used by governments and all kinds of research organizations, institutional organizations. But a few years ago, with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we touched upon the question, will all this information come down to, let's say, where the food production starts, the farmers and the pastoralists? At that time, 5 years ago, our conclusion was it's not there. And just to give you an introduction how we tackled, let's say, this specific question in the Netherlands, and then I will give my presentation.
Space is everywhere, and it's providing a new currency of information, satellite information, rapidly evolving to help solve planet-sized challenges like food security. It's changing the game. 70% of the world's food is provided by smallholder farmers. And in the face of climate change, with the number of global mouths to feed increasing and our resources depleting, smallholder productivity is within all of our interests. Satellites and increasing connectivity are enabling transition from traditional agriculture to climate-smart agriculture. New levels of information on climate-related challenges, such as flooding and droughts, combined with personalized details, crop type and scale, are boosting crop productivity. From pest alerts to the most optimal time to fertilize soil, satellites are changing farming, industries, and lives. Space is not only an opportunity to make our planet future-proof, it's making farmers more resilient, changing sectors such as microcredit and insurance, offering scalable opportunities to business enterprises and investors. It's providing a paradigm shift. And the most exciting part, you can be involved. Join us in using the climate-smart tools of today to ensure the food security of our world tomorrow.
So the role of satellite and other remote sensing systems, digitalization, let's say for the use of sustainable development goals, for the use of food security, but also for water, energy and food nexus. I think that has been, let's say, demonstrated in many research programs. It has been recently highlighted in 3, let's say, big reports that just became published over the last month. We had the CTA Dalberg report, the Malabo report, but also FAO has issued a report in June. So the role of digitalization for agriculture, I think it's clearly there. So what are we doing in that perspective? Now, our role as the Netherlands Space Agency is that we look at the role of satellite data and technology for societal purposes. There are a lot of data around, a lot of satellites around the Earth that really look at our planet from all different perspectives and frequencies. And making use of that, let's say, all these technologies, we are able, in fact, to provide services for instance, for agriculture. Part of these services are in the public domain, and they are provided by research institutions and national government institutions. They are at a relatively global or regional scale, but they don't go into, let's say, more or less the field level. And if you have to go to that, you really have to provide specific services. In the Western countries, we have precision farming, which in fact utilizes a lot of technology. But if you go to developing countries, a lot of this technology is not there. And still, in fact, the big challenge is there. How can we, in fact, how can a farmer or pastoralist get his information, her information, to in fact to take appropriate action, and especially in relation to the climate change. So the challenge has been, I think, addressed in earlier presentation as well. And the challenge is what we have to bring, in fact, is there's a lot of technology there, we have a lot of research there, and how do you bring that into a service that is really usable for a farmer or a pastoralist? And not only usable, but maybe also affordable. That's another question. So there is a lot of research there, and how do you bring that into operations? And part of that is also, you start with an idea, is that you have to bring the different actors that work along, let's say, what we call the information chain together. So the service providers, the companies that really add, let's say, make the knowledge, but how do you connect to farmers? And that's where you have to work with NGOs and departments, with extension officers, really to engage with the food producers. We set up in the Netherlands a program for that, a public-private partnership program. We have now 23 projects running in 14 countries, and several of the countries we are engaged in, I think the ambassadors from these countries are over here. The big challenge with these programs is that the service that they are developing for the farmers, they have to become financially sustainable at the end of the project. So it means that a project has to transform during the project phase into a sustainable enterprise. And that is not easy. That is, in fact, the biggest challenge that we face. However, the first projects are coming to an end, and I will highlight a few of these projects. We have a project funded in Uganda. It's together with the Uganda Coffee Association. It targeted 200,000 coffee farmers, but in 2018, finally 75 farmers were insured. And for this year, 2019, the target is to insure them, to insure 150,000 farmers. So it's an indexed-based insurance, which means that based upon a certain trigger, based on the satellite data and information, the farmer will receive a payout. In Western Africa, in Mali, together with the SNV NGO organization, a service is developed to support pastoralists. You can say it's a TomTom, a navigation system for the pastoralist. They, in fact, the pastoralist will receive information to go to an area where there is sufficient water and vegetation for his herd. And the navigation route is such that it is avoiding agricultural zones, because it is very well known that if the pastoralists go over the agricultural zone, there will be really fights and even casualties. I have heard that in Nigeria a year ago, 1,500 people died because of these clashes. So it's really also, in fact, providing more security in such regions. And we have a similar project also in Burkina Faso. In Ethiopia, it was already mentioned, ATA, the Agricultural Transformation Agency, they are in fact, one of their pillars is to provide the income insurance for smallholder farmers in Ethiopia. And one of the possible ways to do this is to provide an insurance scheme. And in the project that we funded, such an insurance scheme has developed. It has been validated, but due to the, let's say, the insecurity in Ethiopia, it could not be rolled out to whole Ethiopia over the last 2 years. What I've heard very recently that ATA is in fact now in fact starting this program in Ethiopia again. 3 years ago, the target from the ATA was to provide insurance to 15 million smallholder farmers in Ethiopia. So we're really, in fact, waiting up now for ATA and the partners to implement this insurance scheme. Another project which maybe also brings, let's say, the water, energy and food nexus very together is the project Rain for Africa in South Africa with the African Research Council and the South African Meteorological Office. They operate, in fact, an ICT infrastructure platform from which they provide services to water boards, to energy companies, but also to smallholder farmers. And that is developed in this program. And what is very essential about all these different projects is they provide the services to the smallholder farmers, but the smallholder farmer cannot afford to pay for the service. So it means that the service provision has to include a business-to-business component, which the enterprises get revenues, in fact, to also to operate the services for smallholder farmers. A similar project, in fact, coordinated by CTA, was run in Uganda, and also for this project, we are now we are in a kind of transition phase from the project into the enterprise. There's a local enterprise in Uganda that takes up the services, but now we have to secure, let's say, funding and also the service scale up in Uganda. So we are still supporting CTA and partners on that. And just to give you also a summary, you don't have to read it in detail because it's in your handout, but each project is in fact requested to report also in the monitoring and evaluation on the use, let's say, if there is more efficient use of inputs, the water, seeds or nutrients, and this is just an example from the Muse project in Uganda. So we are now at an, in fact, at an interesting period because we see the first results coming up, and we also see the potential of this type of services. So the program from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in fact running out, so the projects will run out, but we see very much a potential for scale up, let's say, to other regions, to other countries as well, and we are very willing to share our knowledge, let's say, to other organizations that would like to pick up and also be active in this area. So if you want to learn more about our program, I left on your desk a small kind of business card from our program. You find the contact details over there, but you can also find various interesting information on the links that will be in the PowerPoint that will be divided electronically. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Ruud, for sharing your experiences and project initial results. Second presenter of this panel is Olufunke Kofi from the International Water Management Institute in Accra. And she will be talking about West Africa experiences. To note as well, she's a soil scientist working on water, which is a mini nexus in its own right. Olufunke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present some of the work that the International Water Management Institute, IMI, has been doing with partners, of course, in different countries in Africa, not only in West Africa. So I'll be talking about some practices in promoting sustainable use of resources in Africa. And basically, I will speak generally about practices that aim at increasing resource productivity, which is one of the ways to maximize the nexus that we've been talking about. One way of maximizing the nexus is to ensure that we use resources efficiently. So I'm going to be talking about, in general, some practices, but narrowing down to two categories and talking a bit more in more details about two categories, one on solar-powered irrigation system and another one on recovering resources and reusing resources that can contribute to maintaining the sustainability of the urban food system. So we know already that water, energy, and food resources have many things in common. Not only are they essential finite commodities, they are also major inputs into other commodities, other goods and services, intermediate goods and services. And I always like to refer to this FAO's framework, Nexus framework, about working the Nexus talk. That is not so much about understanding the approach, but we have to see how to actually address some of the challenges related to the interconnectedness of these resources in practical ways that will help us to move forward and maximize the opportunities that the nexus actually presents. So from that framework, it suggests that we need integrated solutions and approach to actually guide development policies and appropriate practice at different levels. So given that the nexus actually occurs at various scales and dimensions, so also the related practices that are designed to optimize resource use along different sectoral linkages are relevant at different levels. So when we take water and food linkage, we can see that I'm presenting now what IMI has been doing. We have been generating agricultural water management solutions to actually enhance efficient use of water for food production. And there are quite a lot of projects all over in Africa. I just highlighted one recently, which we're still working on in 7 countries, trying to optimize the use of water and ensure that we demonstrate, we show to farmers, we build their capacity, and we try to scale some interventions that will allow efficient water lifting and application on 5 different crops in 7 countries in West, Eastern, and Southern Africa. There are also interventions that allow us to apply digital innovations, ICT-based devices to actually monitor and regulate the scheduling of irrigation. And there are simple devices that are being used that we're training farmers in Ethiopia in working in collaboration with the Agricultural Transformation Agency, actually to scale the use of these scaling tools by farmers so that they do not over-irrigate. They know exactly how to maximize the water that they use, particularly during the dry season. We do that also in Ghana. Beyond the scaling tools, there are quite a lot of other things, particularly like how to reuse wastewater, reuse wastewater generally, using it for irrigation, particularly in the urban and peri-urban areas. We know that though we do not have a extensive sewage network in Africa, but we have open drainage system and we have poor quality water that ends up in downstream, and farmers are using this for agriculture. So IMI has come up with recommendations that can allow farmers to actually reuse water at different entry points, recommendations on the farm level after harvesting the crop, but following the multiple barrier approach that WHO has set up in using wastewater for irrigation. It can also be used for aquaculture, so I'll talk a little bit about that later. So we have different activities in West, East, and Southern Africa where we have disseminated some of these key messages on how they can use that. In terms of energy food linkages, nexus, solar-powered irrigation, I will talk a little bit about that later, but also the aspect of recycling food waste and to convert it to bioenergy is also something that is emerging, and other institutions are doing that, and IMI also has been involved in some activities in this respect. Beyond the low level, I mean at higher level, if we go to upscale, the scale of the basin or the regional transboundary water resources management, IMI has come up with tools and frameworks to actually help in managing, governing, and allocating water to different sectors for food and hydropower, and in managing these resources based on transboundary level, at the transboundary level. For example, in a recent project in Kenya and in Ghana, focusing on the Tana and the Volta River Basin, IMI and partners have worked on how we can maximize the benefits from natural and built water infrastructures, concluding that it's not just about the dams that are built, but we also have to look at naturally existing water structures and look at them in connection with one another, see how to integrate them as much as possible in managing both the water hydropower that is being provided, but also the ecosystems and the livelihood opportunities that farmers will have to depend on. Now, beyond the general things, I said I was going to focus a little bit on solar-powered irrigation system, which is emerging. Generally, the solar pumps are spreading very fast in Africa. Hence, the use of solar for irrigation has the potential to contribute to improved food security. Here we say water and energy linkages. Generally, farmers have limited access to energy for pumping water. And here I'm talking not just about farmers that are working in large schemes, like one of the earlier speakers talked about the fact that people are disappointed in large schemes, but there are thousands and millions of farmers that are practicing small-scale irrigation, farmer-led irrigation system that are looking for opportunities to invest more in irrigation if it's feasible for them. So we see increasing interest in the solar technology, and we also see that the governments, many national governments, are beginning to show interest in this, and several development organizations. So it's notable that if we actually do it well, drawing lessons from where it has worked and where it has failed, that we can actually use this to catalyze the big transformation in the irrigation sector in Africa. So for a more sustainable use of and scaling of solar-powered irrigation, IMI has been developing and promoting innovative business models that represent the sources of revenue generation and benefits for all relevant actors that are involved in such practice. So in this sustainability. So in the business modeling framework, it considers environmental sustainability, the institutional policy and regulatory context, the financing mechanisms, the technology supply chains, and of course, economic sustainability. So these maps of the stability maps that we're looking at, it shows that in Mali, for example, beyond the current irrigation system, it's possible to actually extend irrigation area to about as much as 4.4 million hectares just on solar. And in Ethiopia, we can have up close to 7 million hectares, while in Ghana, it could be up to 4 million hectares on solar in different areas. But it's also important to know that there are different forms. IMI partners have piloted different forms also in India, and we know about the India experiences. We know some of the challenges, and somebody mentioned it earlier on, the role of subsidy and all that. And so we are very careful, because we know that in Africa, our groundwater is still not fully utilized, and we have huge potential to expand irrigation using groundwater resources, but we want to do it sustainably. So we're looking at solutions that we ensure environmental sustainability. So it could be in different forms. So in the business modeling framework that we use, we look at different scenarios to find out exactly what would be fitting in a given context. For example, is it to work together in cooperatives, like the example in India, or to have individual decentralized? Is it off-grid or on-grid and all that, or to combine it with off-farm enterprises where it can generate additional income to farmers? So these options are all there. And all the emerging options could also be using contract farming, agglomerators, middlemen that can actually help to support the farmers. So whichever one that we do, investments in solar irrigation pumps can be profitable from what we have done, but it depends on crop type. It also depends on the type of water delivery system and the cultivated area. But when scaling on solar irrigation, several environmental issues should be considered. The impact of groundwater abstraction in relation to annual groundwater recharge, water quality in terms of suitability for irrigation and potential pollution, and potential increase in changes in soil and biodiversity, and among others. These are some of the things that we need to consider. So basically, we're continuing this and continue our mapping exercises in different countries and developing, applying the business modeling framework. It has been extensively applied to Ethiopia presently, but then we're trying to apply it to different other countries. The second category of practice I talked about is about recovering and reusing resources from food and from wastewater for other sectors. So in this regard, we're looking at waste as a resource, and if we view waste as a resource, we can minimize trade-offs, we can build synergies, and we can increase resource use efficiency as a way of maximizing the nexus between water, food, and energy. So IMI had been working in, recently, last year, we published a catalog, a business model catalog for reuse businesses in urban areas, because it's based on experiences drawn from more than 150 cases globally, and then to look at what is relevant in South, in Africa, or also in Asia, some business models that can really be applied in recovering nutrients, in recovering organic matter, in recovering even carbon for energy, organic matter for agriculture, in recovering water for agriculture or for aquaculture, as the case may be, or for energy. apart from having that knowledge base, we are actually implementing, trying out, piloting with the private sector and under PPP arrangement, different reuse options. Presently in Ghana, we have 3 of such, I think 4 of such PPPs established for 3 reuse businesses. So we come up with technology briefs, business model briefs, and investment briefs that can that can facilitate the involvement of both private and public sector. So one of them is, for example, converting waste to sludge, food waste and human waste to fertilizer. In Ghana, this has been piloted with 2 PPPs already signed to commercialize this. Actually, the product has been certified by the government of Ghana and it's being commercialized. And we get more interest, more demand requests from Benin, from Burkina Faso, from Nigeria to try to do this. IMI is a knowledge institute, so we generate this knowledge, but work together with our local partners to actually take this to scale, because in taking something to scale, we believe strongly that we need to involve the private sector. But for waste, for example, the public has to also be involved, so it's under PPP arrangement. Another option is in landlocked areas where wastewater and where there's a sewage system. This is actually looking at wastewater and where wastewater can actually be used to grow fish. So in Kumasi, we also have another PPP. Kumasi is the second largest city in Ghana. We also have another PPP where young graduates is producing fingerlings using the existing wastewater treatment plant and using the last pond, which is good enough for a particular species, catfish, clarios, for producing fish for the market. And then the idea is that under this PPP arrangement, the part of the proceeds, whether for this or for the fertilizer one, can now be used to actually maintain, operate the treatment facility. So it's a win-win for both the private and the public entity. In West Africa, generally, there's a growing interest of converting food waste to energy, either in form of biogas or briquettes. IMI has been involved in one, but not only IMI. Safisana Ghana is a social enterprise that is actually converting waste, liquid and solid waste into electric powers and to organic fertilizer. IMI is beginning also for IMI has facilitated another PPP where we are going to now convert food waste and agricultural waste into briquettes in lieu of charcoal, and there's demand for that. Local consumers are willing to pay to buy this. So these are some of the initiatives. Also in Benin, I think this WABEF project is actually an EU-funded project where increasingly they are converting bio waste to energy and fertilizers. So increasingly we see these conversions taking place, and what is driving this one? The interest, the scarcity of resources, the competing needs for resources, the enabling environment to actually convert these resources, waste into useful resources, and also some financial incentive to kickstart it. But in terms of scaling, there's need to actually engage more private entrepreneurs in this kind of innovations, because they need to be involved to actually help to take to scale. So in general, we're proceeding with this. An example of ongoing work is for us, we're looking at tackling these global water challenges. IMI Global, tackling these global water challenges through what we describe as R4D missions, addressing specific issues around food and food security, around climate change issues and sustainable growth, not just bringing in those interventions, but actually to ensure that they are sustained over time. Examples of some of the ongoing work that we are doing include like Nexus trade-off analysis, mapping and analysis of the solar irrigation chain and business model development for other countries, and defining scaling pathways for different innovations to go beyond pilot demonstrations and bringing in that business type dimension that can actually help us to sustain what we set out to do. So in brief, that is all. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, and many thanks for sharing the business cases with us. Next speaker is David Gutta from Addis Ababa University, and I'm very interested to see that he's a lecturer, amongst others, on environmental economics, something that I did at the same university about 20 years ago, so we're in a certain way colleagues. David, let us hear about your presentation called Mitigating Trade-offs and Promoting Synergies in the Water, Energy, Food Security Nexus. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this presentation. I'm presenting on water, energy, and the food nexus in Ethiopia, promoting synergies and mitigating trade-offs. Basically, I'm working at the Center for Environment of Addis Ababa University. We have programs on water resource and development, on environment and sustainable development. So we introduced this course on Wave Nexus in water program, and I'm teaching that course as well. And so my presentation will contain highlights of the context of potentials and risks related to water, energy, food nexus in Ethiopia. And then I will highlight the drivers of nexus in the case of Ethiopia. Then I will give some evidences from our studies, going on studies. And then I will show some key interventions in the three sectors. So Ethiopia is the second populous country in Africa with 107 million population, estimated population, and a total land mass of 110 million hectares. So the majority of the population depend on agriculture for their livelihoods, and the country has also strong livestock ownership. According to FAO stat, about 54 million livestock population, which makes it the fifth in the world and first in Africa. So the agricultural sector is dominated by smallholder farmers. It's basically rain-fed and highly vulnerable to changing climate and variability in rainfall. And it is characterized by low level of input use and a low share of irrigated area. So regarding the water resource, the country has abundant water resource, but it is unevenly distributed. And also the underground water resource potential of the country is about 2.6 billion metric cube, which is not harnessed to the level that is required. 70 million inhabitants lack electricity, and 87 million population still depend on biomass energy. And use of biomass energy has outstanding challenges in terms of health, in terms of gender and equity issues. The country also experiences high rate of land degradation, and is also depending highly on hydroelectric power. That makes it vulnerable to climate changes and drought. So some of the wave nexus drivers are rapid population, economic growth and population growth. So the country is growing at high rate for the last decade and a half, and still is growing at high rates. So with growth in economy, there is an increase in demand for non-agricultural demand for water in the industrial sector, and the urban sector is expanding sharply. And there is also change in preference for food, high demand for electricity, and the electricity sector is vulnerable to climate change because of dependence on hydroelectric power. As a result of this, there is a blackout of electricity, interruption of electricity, that the urban sector is even experiencing. The other is rapid population growth of annual rate of 2.6. That means around 2 million population each year. So climate change is a strong challenge that affects food production, water availability, and the hydro energy production. 95% of the crop production is rain-fed, and it is vulnerable to drought. 83% of electricity generation is from hydropower, which is also vulnerable to drought. So climate change is an outstanding challenge for the country. So I would like to highlight two of the national strategies that how they are focusing on water, energy, and the food nexus elements. We have a national growth and transformation plan, GTP, which the one is ended already, has already ended, and the second phase is now ongoing. So in this GTP plan 2, from 2060 to 2020, irrigation development is considered as an important tool to stimulate sustainable economic growth and food security and poverty reduction. So the government is giving a strong emphasis to irrigation to create jobs for the youth, as well as to improve food security and reduce poverty. So it also gives emphasis to electricity, improving population with access to electricity, and the development of large-scale hydropower projects, including the Grand Renaissance Dam, you know. Many of these projects are, however, lagging behind and also has implication in terms of cost of construction is because of the rise in price that has implication for cost and finance. The other strategy is climate resilient green growth economy that was introduced in 2011. So this strategy is about sustainable development that creates green economy, about reducing greenhouse gas emission, aims at increasing resilience of the most vulnerable sector, of which water, energy, and food are one. The four pillars of this climate resilient economic growth are improving crop and livestock production practices, which directly is about food security. The second one is about protecting forest and reforestation, which has interaction with all the three wave nexus. The third one is expanding electricity generation from renewable resources. And the last one is about leapfrogging to modern and energy efficient technologies. So both the strategies strongly emphasize on water, energy, and the food nexus. This is a bit all the data about food security, humanitarian assistance. As you can see from the 2013-2017, there was a sharp rise in transitory food insecure and chronic food insecure population. And this problem is even worsened by the recent ongoing conflicts in the country. People are displaced from their home and so on. So the water and energy, water and food issue is a very burning issue. The other is about water resource potential of the country. As you can see, we have 12 rivers, big rivers, and huge irrigation potential and irrigable land area. So water access and energy access, specifically in the rural area, has a strong implication on the gender equity issue, on health, and on education, and so on. So some of the studies highlighted here show, especially in the rural areas where water is consumed in raw form, that causes disease among the children. And also it has implication for the women time allocation and children education. So we have done empirical studies on this issue, and I will summarize those empirical studies at the end. Sustainable agriculture intensification and irrigation. The country has emphasized, as I've said, on irrigation, and that would synergize nexus. So these are some evidences showing the irrigation and sustainable agricultural intensification in the country. So the energy sector, the country has huge potential in renewable energy resources, almost all type of energy resources. solar, hydro, biomass, and so on. But biomass is overutilized, and that caused deforestation and several natural problems. So that's the summary of energy resources of the country. So there is a need for energy transition from traditional energy sources like biomass to modern energy sources, not only for residential sector, however, also for the agricultural sector. Transformation in agriculture requires transformation in energy as well. So, however, the country's electricity sector is dependent on hydropower, as I've already said. Over 90% of the Ethiopia's electricity is generated from hydropower. And the country is also targeting to export electricity to the region, but it's suffering from frequent drought and water shortage. So siltation problem is another issue, that land degradation in the upper stream causes siltation in the reservoirs, loss of reservoir volume. Hydrological variability also costs the country. According to World Bank 2006, 1/3 of the growth of the country is on this loss of hydrological problem. So biogas is another thing that the country is focusing on. We have a national biogas program. The country has huge potential in biogas, and the country is promoting biogas for households, small-scale biogases. The other is technological solution, distribution of energy-efficient technologies, and the promotion of alternative modern energy sources. So, as I've said, I have been engaging in one of the projects on the Eastern Blue Nile. We have conducted studies on household level and decentralized energy at community level, and also at macro level on the Nile countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. So I was part of the micro and decentralized energy team. So I would like to highlight some of the findings from those studies. So at household level, we applied the agricultural household model to analyze household simultaneous production and consumption of food and energy. So in that, we considered allocation of resources, including time, labor, land, and other resources. So the implication of that study, the paper is ongoing. The implication is that there is a competition for female family labor for energy and food production. So as female are engaged in energy collection, then there will be less available time for food production. So that's the trade-off. So our study also shows that agroforestry, tree cultivation, will promote food and energy production. Farmers are growing trees to generate cash income that they can use to purchase food, because most of the lands are also being degraded, is not productive in terms of food production. Then they allocate to abandoned land to tree cultivation. They generate cash from that and spend on food. The other is crop production is positively influenced by sustainable land management, better access to market, and the livestock ownership. So this is household model that the finding of our study. So agroforestry also reduces time required for energy collection, which can be saved for food production, as well as for off-farm work that increases household food security. So synergizing agricultural production through improved access to energy can be catalyzed by improved access to market, input market, output market, credit market, and also insurance. Adoption of agroforestry practices, livestock ownership, high input use to increase productivity, adoption of sustainable land management practices, investing in agricultural research and extension services. So these are implications of our study. The second paper is on decentralized energy. We used a model for that. And that shows subsidies can accelerate energy transition to more efficient and cleaner energy sources in rural areas of Ethiopia. But when we see rich and poor households, the richer are going to benefit more than the poor. So improving access to non-farm jobs has a substantial poverty reduction impact, but was associated with lower own food production. So what are the key interventions that are needed in the three sectors: water, land, and energy? Agriculture intensification is very important, and that is also requires irrigation, energy, and fertilizer use. From water side, increasing water efficiency and productivity is very critical. Integrated water shade management and development of irrigation scheme, which the government is also targeting to create employment for the youth. Recently, the government announced a large expansion in irrigation to create job for the youth. The energy, from energy side, diversifying energy mix to alternative renewable resources and the use of energy efficiency is very important. Particularly the waste to energy initiative in Addis is of its first kind in Africa. National biogas program, and also the government is investing on solar, wind, geothermal, and so on. From land side, sustainable land management practice is very important to reduce runoffs and increase crop yield. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing us the empirical evidences as well from your research. We move on to the final presentation, and we go really down south in Africa, and we have a presentation from Tavatswa Mabaudi, and he's a researcher at the School of Agriculture, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So, Tavatswa, the floor is yours. And I wanted to say that we do have 10 minutes more for discussion, so you have your full 10-15 minutes for your presentation now. So.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the work that we have been doing in South Africa. So I'll be presenting on a summary of a project that we have undertaken in South Africa related to the WEF Nexus. So one of the things about presenting last is, people have taken all the thunder and said everything. So, so I need to avoid a lot of repetition. So I'll avoid the definitions and stuff. And just to give some background to our issues in South Africa, South Africa is a water-scarce country. We are one of the 30 driest countries in the world. Much of South Africa is classified as being arid to semi-arid. In terms of context, we have high food insecurity. Whilst we are food secure at a national level, about 30% of households still face massive food insecurity. Owing to the background of South Africa, we have massive issues of inequality and poverty. So we are very much a developmental state. We have challenges related to sustainable resource management and how to govern those. And we've been looking at various strategies of informing and implementing sustainable economic development. And that is the context in which the WEF Nexus is being viewed from a South African perspective in terms of job creation, reducing poverty and inequality, and closely linking it to Sustainable Development Goals 2, 6, and 7. So from a national perspective, South Africa does have a lot of information from a sector-based perspective related to the governance of the three sectors. The Water, Energy, Food Nexus, we started working on it from about 2014, and there have been several projects that have happened. but those have mainly taken foot from 2016 onwards. And the research has mostly been driven through the universities, funded mostly by the Water Research Commission of South Africa, which is a state-funded agency with a mandate for funding research in the water sector. So, like I said, South Africa is generally more advanced relative to our neighbors in Southern Africa. So normally when we want to do comparisons for Southern Africa, we would remove South Africa. It kind of distorts the information. So in terms of the key indicators, since 1994, there has been a steady improvement and increase in access to water, access to electricity, and access to food. And that's primarily coming from a background of apartheid, where there was a lot of segregation and exclusion. So there has been a steady increase in those, but it has also created a subsequent burden on the system. From a provincial perspective, there are key issues in South Africa which are related to the water, energy, food nexus. One is a question around the sustainability of exporting virtual water. Those who are familiar or who have been reading would have read about the drought in Cape Town, which reached a critical point last year or so. They were looking at day zero. And there's a lot of exporting that happens from the Western Cape in general, fruit, vine, and so forth. And questions are being asked now in terms of the sustainability of the province going forward in terms of exporting fruit, which we're looking at as virtual water export, and the returns of doing that. So that is a key water, energy, food nexus type of issue. We've also got issues related to the threats on agricultural land in terms of colonization by alien invasive species, which is reducing amount of arable land as well as grazing lands in other provinces of South Africa. We also have issues related to expansion in energy in other provinces of South Africa, such as Mpumalanga, where coal mining concessions have been granted on land that was, or that is some of the most fertile land in South Africa. And there are risks because it's also located in one of the most sensitive catchments in the country. So there again, you've got energy considerations overriding food and water considerations. In terms of energy, again, we've got a sensitive issue that is still being debated in the Karoo, which is a very dry area, but they found deposits of shale gas, so they want to do fracking in that area. But it's a very sensitive area. It's very water scarce. If there's a drought, it's one of the hardest hit areas. But again, you have energy considerations almost overriding the other two, water and food in that area. And then what we have done in South Africa is we started looking at the WEF nexus from trying to understand convergence from a sector-based perspective. So we did some policy analysis right at the beginning to look at whether our policy framework actually allows or would facilitate the adoption of the water, energy, food nexus. So South Africa has world-class policies and documents. We've got a very progressive constitution and very progressive laws. However, the current policy framework is still very sector-based and driven from a strongly sectorial perspective. So whilst there are key national documents such as the Constitution and National Development Plan, which speak to integration, the policies on the ground themselves limit the integration from a practical perspective. At a technical level, some of the things that we have been looking at in South Africa is the need to diversify our energy mix. So unlike other countries in the region that strongly rely on hydroelectricity, South Africa's energy mix is mostly driven by coal. So there's a need to diversify that and promote more green technology, more renewable energy sources. Recently, our president announced in his State of the Nation address the need to innovate and come up with a smart city. So again, we are looking at technologies in that space. One of the key challenges that we have in terms of managing resources is around the issue of education and access to information. So it reminded me of what one lady said at the beginning of this meeting, who was talking about women fetching firewood and water. And that also presents another challenge that we have, that there is policy mismatch. So if you recall at the beginning, I mentioned that South Africa is food secure at a national level, but there is still about 6.8 million people who face hunger every day, another 10.4 million who have inadequate access to food, roughly about 30% of the population being food insecure. So if you look at the national statistics and the household level statistics, there's a mismatch. But the level of formulation of policy is at the national level, but the level at which you want to bring about change is at the household level. So you get a mismatch in that the policies drive food security at national, but at the household level, the household dynamics still remain unchanged, and that is still exacerbating things like poverty and inequality. And where, as I said, they are looking at the wealth nexus in terms of trying to turn around that whole situation of inequality and poverty. So implementing the wealth nexus in South Africa, so far we've held multi-stakeholder dialogues. So the GWP dialogues was one of them. We've had one that we facilitated with Future Earth in 2017 as well. And there have been other smaller dialogues facilitated by the Water Research Commission, the most recent one having happened in February this year. There is scope for improvement of information and interest to be generated. However, we face key challenges in terms of implementing the wealth nexus, and those are related to access to data that is comparable and robust enough. There is the question on research methodologies that need to be improved for the wealth nexus to allow for wealth nexus performance, evaluation and monitoring. So that is just a summary of those, a review of some of our policies in terms of facilitating the convergence that is needed to inform implementation. We've attempted to develop a framework to guide implementation of the wealth nexus in South Africa, where we've identified the drivers or challenges, and we've identified the desirable outcomes and goals, and those are mostly aligned to the sustainable development agenda in terms of where we want to get to as South Africa and how we would want to unlock the wealth nexus. And that has to be driven by policies that facilitate innovation in that space and also unlock finances, especially from the international donors, to be able to help us move in that direction. We need to be able, one of the limitations for adoption of the wealth nexus that we have identified from our research is that there is a lack of indices and metrics for analyzing and evaluating the wealth nexus. So that means even when people try to work together, but for reporting purposes, they default back to the sector-based, and that also disincentivizes the collaboration. So we are doing research on developing a composite WEF Nexus index and an analytical framework. Key challenges which I've highlighted before and our conclusions. So the main conclusion coming from the work that we are doing is, one, we need to develop an analytical model for assessing WEF Nexus performance matched to a WEF Nexus score. We need to develop a framework beyond this that actually guides implementation. How do we operationalize the WEF Nexus? We need to answer a key question with regards to scale. Where does it make the most sense to apply the WEF Nexus? People mentioned earlier on the transboundary nature of resources. Water is transboundary in Southern Africa and managed at that level. Energy, also through the Southern African power pool, is driven from a regional perspective. It's only food mostly where countries choose a national food self-sufficiency agenda. But given climate change and the trade-offs that we are seeing, we might need to shift that national approach to food security and look at a regional one. From a national perspective, where does it make sense? National, provincial, catchment-based, where do we implement the WEF Nexus? Thank you.
Thank you, Tevatsva, and thank you as well for highlighting the need to develop indices, metrics around the nexus, which is indeed not an easy one. With that, we have about 10 minutes for questions, remarks, and additions from the floor. Who would like to kick off? Any questions or remarks? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. This Kaimenyi is my name from Kenya. My question is directed to Ruud Grimm, who talked about the use of satellite to do warnings on pests and disease, droughts and floods, which is a good idea. But what baffles me once in a while, Mr. President, is the lack of preparedness on the part of our respective governments, despite these warnings. So I wanted to find out from him what can be done about it. Is it because the governments don't give it a priority, these warnings a priority, or is lack of funds? And finally, Orofuke Kofie, there is something lacking in our culture with regard to solar power irrigation. We have a lot of energy there, water harvesting. So again, what can we do really to energize our people to resort to water harvesting and even reusing wastewater? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me immediately... Professor, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Just a short comment. Here again, I'm interested in the impact on the citizens' well-being, quality of life, all these discussions. I mean, it's interesting intellectual entertainment. Then what? I mean, to my mind, there are too many nexuses. Sorry, Veronica. Too many projects, action plans, roadmaps, forgetting the essentials, which is reconnecting with the citizens. Without trust, any policy shall fail, whatever the political program anywhere in the world. That's one thing. Now, assuming that we can recover lost trust, it's not building trust, it's recovering lost trust, which is extremely difficult, not to say impossible, then there is a need to explore how to constructively articulate all these different nexuses, action plans, roadmaps, initiatives together to achieve and sustain the citizens' well-being, quality of life and world society, which is, after all, the third millennium's top priority. So it's a big question mark for me. I'm not convinced. I don't have the impression that we're going around in circles, not getting anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you for that remark. Did I miss? Isolina.
Thank you very much. I had one actually this morning also for Greg, and that can apply to the panel now. South Africa or the other colleagues from the field is the actually prevention of conflict due to the pressure on resources. So you did mention the transboundary cooperation. Do you experiment that? And the one I had for Greg before is from the analysis you have done. West Africa was a part a bit this morning. Do you see common trends, or the drivers of conflict are very local specific, or do you still can you already see some common trends across regional countries? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let's try to get to the answers of the questions. The first question was to Ruth Grimm from the Kenyan ambassador. You recall the question?
Yeah, it was, if I understood well, related to the role of the government. I think also maybe also related to
preparedness on the side of governments. Yes.
Yeah. Now, I know that several programs are running in the region, and also Kenyan, institutions are involved. I think one institution is called RCMRD, and I think it's operating from Nairobi. So there are a lot of, organizations and activities working on, gathering satellite data and making that, turning that into services and advices. But one thing is that what we also quite often see is that for some reason it stays within the government. And that was also why we turned our program really at, focusing on the needs of farmers and engaging with farmers and building, of course, the trust. And that's why we work together with NGOs and with department officers, with extension officers, because that is really, the essence. And if the service that is provided has no added value for the citizen, for the farmer, he will or will turn away from the services. So really measuring the uptake of these services constantly is a very crucial factor. And we do actually see this in, our projects, especially in Southeast Asia. This is really happening quite well, and it's working. And lastly, about Iselina, about the transboundary aspect. Yeah, if you have pastoralists moving from Mali to Burkina Faso to Chad, I don't know exactly how they are migrating over there in this region, but these services really, should be transboundary. Thank you.
Thank you. And the other question from the ambassador of Kenya was to Olufunke.
Yeah, thank you very much. You asked about what can be done with people to make them interested. And this is also related to what the professor, I think, said, is about how do we connect people. But the way I see those two questions is not necessarily about how to connect people, it's how to go to scale. Because people are at the center of all these initiatives. People are really involved, but how do we go from the micro pilot level to scale? How do we reach out to more? I think that is the thing. And here I think there are multiple dimensions to that. There are government's role, but there's also the role of the private entities, the private sector, to actually bring them to scale some of those interventions. So when we talk about solar, come to think about it, solar panel, solar system is still very expensive for the average farmer in many of the countries. So the issue is what to be the appropriate financing mechanism to ensure that the farmers can have access to it, not just having access to the solar system equipment, but even to be able to maintain it after service repairs and all that. So from our perspective as a knowledge institute, what we're trying to look at is to see different modalities and come up with recommendations that can inform decision-making, policy processes and other actors in terms of what is the best way to go about it. For example, in some of the projects we are implementing, we're looking at, in Ethiopia, we're looking at some of the policy that the government has introduced in terms of tax waiver and all that to see what impact will it make, how will it incentivize the private entities to actually work together with these farmer-led irrigation system to actually make it go to scale. We're going to do that in other countries as well. So there are different ways. I think people are at the center, but it's scaling. It's just like micro here and there, but we need to go to scale, and we need policies, we need the private entities, we need multiple actors to work on this.
If you want citizens to listen to you, you must first overcome their prevailing suspicion and recover their trust. Otherwise, they won't listen to you and they won't be interested in doing skills.
I agree. And if you look at the second category of practice I talked about, we're talking about products that maybe sometimes citizens may not be interested in. So how do we get their buy-in? So one thing about of course, there's what citizen science, and there was one thing also about people is that when they see that something works, if the farmer sees that water harvesting works, or solar works, or irrigation scheduling tool works, they will adopt. They want to listen to it. In Ethiopia, for example, we use this chameleon and water fund detector only for about 200 farmers. These 200 farmers were able to reach hundreds of farmers on their own because they could also see that this thing works. So they're able to schedule their irrigation practices according to that. So I think it's still about scaling and starting with where are the bright spots? Where is it already working? And how can we learn from that? How can, like farmers, how can they learn from one another? It's a couple of, just mix of several things that we have to put together to make it work, go to scale.
Thank you. Tavatswa, the question from Isolina about conflict prevention in South Africa.
Thank you. So far there's not been any conflict in terms of resources and competition for resources. But from a climate change scenario analysis perspective, we anticipate that there is going to be conflict, mostly emerging from competition for water, because it's the most scarce resource throughout the region. Most of Southern Africa itself is semi-arid, and the bulk of water is in the north, in Zambia and the DRC. But from an infrastructure perspective, most of the dams are in South Africa and Zimbabwe. So it needs a regional approach to guiding investment. And the countries that have money might need to go and construct dams in the other countries where the resources are. We've had success in terms of piloting how that can be done with the South Africa Lesotho Highlands project, where South Africa has invested in dam infrastructure in Lesotho, and Lesotho now supplies South Africa, Gauteng primarily, with water. So we need to do more of that. In terms of agriculture as well, the productive areas, especially for cereal production, have been moving over time. So the traditional cereal production areas might not be able to sustain regional demand going into the future. So again, there needs to be a regional approach to food production and securing regional food security.
Thank you. Regional approaches, that's where the EU is good at. Good. Craig, for you the question also from Isolina.
Yeah, the question was about, based upon our piloting research on predicting conflict. So first of all, the caveat is we're still figuring out, perfecting the algorithms, etc. Right? Secondly, have we seen any trends, etc. On that? I mean, it's one thing I can say is that it's not one thing, and oftentimes, what we're looking for is the biophysical elements, right? That the rainfall goes down or whatever, right? But what you'll see is you might actually have situations where two neighboring countries, the same biophysical phenomena happening, one ends up in conflict and one not, right? And that points to some social or governance issue that's at play as well. That's that extra factor, right? And so it is the interplay of these multiple things. And I hope over time, and as more research comes along, we'll start to decide what's the relative weighting of them. But right now, I can't say more than that.
Thank you. David, would you have anything to add from the questions or the remarks?
No, basically, regarding the conflict, resource scarcity is a fueling thing, and climate change as well. In Ethiopia, the conflict is not mainly because of resource, as you may have heard of it. There are several factors that affect the social traction and conflicts. So basically, the problem is when people are displaced, the issue of food security and the issue of water security especially are very important. And in our case, these factors are contributing to even worsening security of the three sectors. In the regional issue, in one of the study, macro study, we have seen, colleagues have seen the food production, for example, in Sudan and in Egypt, and energy production in Ethiopia, so that there will be regional trade. So they have seen this national trade and optimization of the water for food production, for energy production, so that the countries can trade among themselves, and there will be synergies.
Good. With those positive words, Funke, I give you the last word, and then my neighbor will say some closing remarks.
Yeah, just on the conflict issue, I think we don't really have to wait until the conflict comes up before we start responding to it. And I think dialogue is very important. And dialogue not only at the basin level or high national level, even at the local level. There are simple tools, like games that people can use at local level, participatory tools that can make people to be more knowledgeable and more conscious about the nexus and how they can manage it at the local level. Same tools can also be applied at higher level. So I think dialogue, multi-stakeholder dialogue is really very important and must be used. And it's a kind of participatory process to manage the nexus and other resources very well.
Many thanks, and with that we come to nearly the end of the session. As the last word, I would like to give to Mr. Banze from the ACP, so with that then we end the session.
Well, last word, it's really strong. So let me exercise my Portuguese language. I've been listening. Primeiro, queria apresentar.
Firstly, I would like to apologize for the Secretary General not being present here at this stage, and I couldn't come this morning because there were many overlapping obligations. But without a doubt, I can say that it was an immense pleasure for us to once again host this briefing at the ACP House. We consider that this is one of the ways that we can contribute to our member states. As you know, there are 79 member states. We have African, Caribbean, and Pacific states in the ACP. And we are truly a transcontinental organization. And regional issues that are being discussed are of the utmost importance to us. And on the basis of our solidarity, common challenges, and the diversity that we have, we consider we have a great contribution to make. And such briefings are really very valuable for the ACP to achieve our goals. And today we're particularly pleased to discuss a theme which is practically at the basis of the existence of all. We cannot live without land, without water, without food. And this is, of course, a very important component of all the basic issues that we need. However, in many of our countries, surviving and living, having food and a place to sleep and water to drink remains a challenge. So this is very relevant, and here the CTA and the director are doing a great job in bringing this issue to the table. I was not able to listen to all the presentations, but what I've heard showed the importance of some challenges that remain. There are three aspects that I would like to underscore. One is implementation. I think that is critical. That is the level we are, macro level, strategic level, if you want, and policy design. And what is important now is to convince our leaders, but also our citizens, that they can see the value of what we're doing, how we can use the knowledge that is being presented here in all its diversity. And second aspect is the impact we have on people's lives. How do they see this knowledge comes to be useful for them? That's also very critical. And a third aspect, I didn't follow everything, but in the previous panel it was mentioned how all this nexus between land, water, and energy, and the contribution that women, girls, and the youth in general can play in our countries. In many of our countries, we depend on agriculture, and mainly young people and women do most of the work. So this is a very important aspect that we need to take into account when we discuss issues such as agriculture and water issues. Then there's another aspect that I heard here, how we should bring together all the aspects, not just geographic issues, but also when we look at the work that the ACP is doing in terms of South-South cooperation, exchange of experience, and the possibility to scale up the knowledge. And this forum gives more substance to that objective, and this is a way that we can further contribute. Lastly, I would like to commend you for holding this briefing. Welcome to all who've participated, the moderator, all the speakers, all the participants, all the diplomatic missions present here. We see some ambassadors. The ambassador of Kenya is always very actively participating in these meetings. And thank you to our colleagues from ACP, the CTA, of course, our colleagues from the conference servers, the interpreters, with all their patience, who've enabled us to speak in various languages and understand one another. So I wish you every success in the work that you're doing, and we look forward to the future briefings so that we can also talk about the results of this discussion. How this makes a difference in our citizens' lives and how we can move forward. It's already July. For those who will soon go on holiday, I wish you very enjoyable holidays and continue your work. Thank you very much.
And a few final words as well. Dr. Hailu from CTA.
Well, normally I would do a quick wrap-up, but the ASG, Mr. Banze, did a fantastic job. Although he wasn't there, I don't know how he managed to summarize it very well. So all the points I had here, they're already covered, in terms of the key issues that came up. In any case, I would just like to say that, as you all agree with me, we had a very rich discussion this morning in terms of the intellectual issues, the framework, and also in terms of the practice, what's happening and where we should be pushing more of our efforts in terms of scaling up and so on. So I think we really had a very fruitful and very useful discussion. I really like to take this opportunity on behalf of CTA to thank our speakers who brought in very rich experience and insights into the discussions. I would also like to thank our chair, Wim Olthoff. I mean, he did a fantastic job, chairing the two sessions and leading us through the discussions. Of course, I'd like to thank the ACP Secretariat for giving us this excellent facility, as well as the support of the interpreters. I mean, we always very much appreciate the opportunity to have these discussions here. So with all that, I also thank you all for being here with us up to the end, and my colleague Isolina and other colleagues who are supporting to putting this all together. It takes a huge amount of effort to bring this together. So I'd like to thank Isolina and my other colleagues as well for their inputs. And finally, I would like to invite you for the networking lunch, where hope you can continue with some of these discussions. So thank you very much.